Hey there, and welcome back. If you are already settled, with the lights low and the day loosening its grip on you at last, then you have come to the right place tonight. This is an evening for a single ordinary day, lived a very long time ago, in a place where nothing at all was easy and almost everything was done by hand. It is for anyone who has ever felt that the modern world moves too fast and wondered, quietly, what it took to keep a household alive before there were taps or switches or matches or a shop at the end of the road. Tonight I am going to give you that day. I am going to set you down inside the body of a woman waking in the cold dark of an autumn morning in the year 1770, in a farmhouse in the uplands of Connecticut, and I am going to walk you through her day from the moment she opens her eyes to the moment she covers the last coals for the night. You will not need to remember anything. You will not need to do anything but lie there and let it come to you. And somewhere in the middle of it, when the bread is in the oven and the wheel is turning and the child is calling from the yard, I think you may find, as I always do, that a life this hard could also be, in its own plain way, deeply and unexpectedly peaceful. Somewhere far off, in a city she has never seen, men are beginning to argue about liberty and taxes and a king across an ocean. She has heard a little of it. It will not reach her lane for years. Tonight is not about them. Tonight is about her, and the fire, and the long day between one banking and the next. Before we step into that morning, one small thing. If these quiet evenings are something you would like to find again, you are always welcome to subscribe, and then they will simply come to you, the way the seasons came to her, without your having to go looking. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, because the woman whose day we are about to share kept the time by the light and the animals and the church bell, and never once in her life knew the exact minute of anything, and I find there is something restful in that. Leave it in the comments below if you feel like it. I love looking through them, and there is no hurry and no wrong answer. Picture this. It is the last hour before dawn, in the back country of Connecticut, in October, in the year 1770. The house is dark and it is bitterly cold, the deep chill of a room in which the fire has burned down to almost nothing and the outside air has been pressing at the walls all night. You are lying in a bed built into a corner of the ground floor room, under a heap of woolen coverlets and a worn quilt, beside a husband who is still asleep, and you have been awake for a few minutes already, listening. You are listening for the wind, which tells you what kind of day it will be. You are listening for the animals in the lean-to, and for the breathing of the children in the loft above your head. And you are listening, without quite knowing you are doing it, for the small settling sound of the coals on the hearth, because that fire is the most important thing in this house, and you have been trained since you were a girl of 5 to think of it before you think of anything else. There is a great deal you can tell, lying still in the dark before you ever open your eyes fully or set a foot to the cold floor. You can tell from the quality of the cold and the sound of the wind at the walls roughly what the day will bring, whether a hard frost has come in the night, whether rain is on the way, whether it will be a fine day for the drying or a wet one that keeps the wash indoors. You can tell from the light or the lack of it at the edges of the shutters how near the dawn is. You can tell from the small sounds of the house and the beasts that all is well, that nothing has got loose in the night, that no child is crying, that the night has held. All of this you take in without thought, in the first drowsy moments, the long habit of a life lived close to the weather and the animals and the light. The season is autumn, deep autumn, October, and the year is 1770, and that matters to everything you will do today. The high heat of summer is gone, and the killing cold of winter is not yet come. And this is the busiest and most driving stretch of the whole year, the time of gathering in and laying by, when every fine day is precious and must be used to the full before the weather closes down. Outside, if you could see it, the hills are turning, the maples gone to flame and gold, the fields cut to stubble, the mornings sharp with the first real frosts, the light shortening at both ends of the day. The apples are in. The last of the harvest is coming home. And in a household like yours, the autumn is a race against the coming cold, to get the food stored, the meat salted, the soap and candles made, the wood laid in, the last of the garden lifted, so that when the snow comes, as it will, and shuts the world down for months, the family will be provisioned, and warm and safe inside its own walls. Today is one day of that race. It is an ordinary day, but there is no idle season in it, and no idle hour, because the year is turning toward the dark, and there is everything still to do. Let me hold you here in the dark for a moment before the day takes hold, because the beginning of the day tells you almost everything about the shape of the whole of it. The chamber you are lying in is not one room in the way we would mean it. It is the family's whole living space, and it does everything at once. It is the kitchen, because the fireplace is here. It is where they dine, because the board stands here. It is the sitting room and the workroom and the nursery of the small ones by day. And it is where you sleep, because your bed is built right into the corner, a boxed-in bed, sometimes with a curtain that can be drawn against the draught, because the warmth of the fire, even banked, even dying, is worth being near in the cold months, and because there is simply nowhere else to put it. The idea that a grown couple would keep a whole room set aside only for sleeping, heated, private, empty all day, would strike you as an extraordinary and faintly absurd luxury, a waste of the space, and a waste of a fire. So you have slept a few feet from the hearth in your shift under a great weight of coverlets, and you have slept, lightly, not deeply. Sleep in this world is not the long, unbroken thing we expect. You may have woken in the small hours as people often did, lain awake a while in what the old writers called the watch between the two sleeps. Listened to the house and the wind and the animals, thought your thoughts in the dark, and drifted off again. You have risen once in the night into the freezing air to use the chamber pot because there is no other arrangement, and the privy in the yard is a cold, dark walk you will not take before you must. The night has its own quiet labours and its own quiet discomforts, and you are used to all of them, and you have never known anything else, and so they do not trouble you the way they would trouble us. There is no clock. There may be one clock in the whole parish, in the meeting house, or in the home of the richest man in the district, and you are not that man's wife. You are the wife of a farmer of middling sort, a man with 60 or 70 acres, some of it good and some of it stony, a few cows, a yoke of oxen, a horse, some sheep and swine, and a flock of poultry, and a house he built the greater part of himself. You tell the time the way everyone you have ever known tells the time, by the sky, by the light behind the eastern hills, by the crowing of the cock, by hunger, and by the bell that rings across the valley on the days it rings. And right now, in the black cold before any of that, you know only one thing for certain. It is time to get up, because the fire will not tend itself. And if it has died in the night, the whole day is already in trouble. Let me tell you why that fire matters so much. Because everything else tonight grows out of it. You have no way to make fire quickly. There are no matches. They will not be invented for another 60 years and more. To start a fire from nothing, you must use a flint and a piece of steel and a scrap of charred linen for tinder, and strike sparks, and coax them, and blow, and feed the first thread of flame with the driest and finest kindling you have, and it can take a long while, and on a damp morning it can take longer than you can bear. So you do not start from nothing. No one in this whole country starts cold if they can help it. Instead, every single night of your life, you bank the fire, you rake the living coals into a heap, and you cover them, either with ashes or with a curved metal cover made for exactly this purpose, and you leave them to smoulder low and slow through the dark hours, so that in the morning there is still a red heart under the grey, and from that red heart you can raise the whole day's fire in minutes rather than hours. The word for that metal cover is a curfew. It is a very old word. It comes from the French couvre-feu, cover the fire, and it is the same word that would one day mean a bell telling people to go indoors and put their lights out, and it began right here, at a hearth like this one, meaning nothing more than the humble iron thing you set over the embers, so the house would not go cold or dark or, worst of all, catch a light while you slept. So the first act of your day, before you are properly awake, before there is any light to see by, is an act of faith in your own carefulness the night before. You push back the coverlets into the cold. You feel with your feet for the floor, which is bare board and icy. You do not dress fully, not yet. You pull something warm about your shoulders, and you cross the room in the dark, and you kneel at the hearth. And you reach for the fire the way a mother reaches for a child in the night, already half certain of what you will find, but needing to be sure And there it is, under the soft grey blanket of last night's ashes. When you move them gently aside with the little iron shovel, a dull red glow breathing. The fire has kept. You let out a breath you did not know you were holding. On the morning it has not kept, and there will be such mornings in the depth of winter when the cold has been merciless and the coals have died despite everything. You will have to take the tinder box and the flint and steel and begin the slow, patient, knuckle-scraping business of striking a light. Or worse, send one of the children out into the raw dawn to the nearest neighbour, a quarter of a mile off or more, to beg a shovelful of live coals to carry home under a cloth. But not today. Today the fire has kept, and so the day can begin as it should. Now you build it up, and there is a craft to this that you have never once thought of as a craft, because you have been doing it since before you can remember. You do not simply pile on wood. You feed the coals first with the finest, driest kindling, the split slivers of pine full of resin that catch almost at a look, and you lean down close enough to feel the first warmth on your face, and you blow. Perhaps you use a blowing tube, a long hollow iron pipe that lets you send a thin, steady stream of air right into the heart of the embers without scorching your face, and you watch the grey coals flush to orange and then to yellow, and then the first small flame stands up among the kindling wavers and holds, and you feed it. Larger pieces now, but still not the big logs, not yet. You are waking the fire the way you might wake a person, gently, in stages, letting it come to itself. There is a small daily pleasure in this if you let yourself feel it, and some mornings you do. The house has been dark and cold and still, and now, under your hands, light and warmth are being born again in the middle of it. The first flame stands up gold in the grey. It begins to reach your face, your hands, then to spread slowly into the frozen room. The shadows leap and settle on the walls and the low ceiling. The pewter on the dresser begins to catch and throw back the growing light. And the house, which was a cold, dead shell a few minutes ago, becomes again a living centre, a hearth in the old full sense of the word, the heart of a home. You have done this every morning of your life, and you will do it every morning left to you, and most mornings you do it half asleep and thinking of the next thing. But now and then, kneeling there in the new firelight with the day not yet begun and the house not yet awake, you feel it for what it is. The daily small miracle of making light and warmth out of a red coal and a breath, the oldest human act there is, performed at this hearth as it has been performed at every hearth since the beginning of people. Only when it is burning well and confidently do you lay on the heavy wood, the seasoned oak and maple and hickory that will burn hot and long, and give you the bed of coals you will need for the whole day's cooking. And I should tell you what it was to be without that red heart in the morning, because it happened, and it was one of the small dreads of a woman's life. If the fire died if you had banked it badly, or the wood was poor, or the cold was simply too deep, then in the black of the morning you faced the tinder box. Inside that little box is a piece of flint, a curved strip of steel, some scraps of charred linen, and a few splints of wood tipped with sulphur that will catch a flame and pass it on. You hold the flint and strike down the steel against its edge, again and again throwing sparks, trying to land one of those tiny dying stars onto the charcloth so that it catches and glows, and then you breathe on it and coax the glow to the sulphur splint and pray it take. On a good morning with a dry box, it is the work of a minute or two. On a damp morning with cold hands, in the dark it can be the work of a quarter of an hour of scraped knuckles and rising temper, and this is exactly why no one ever, if they could help it, let the fire go out. The banked coal in the morning was not laziness saved. It was a quarter hour of misery avoided every single day, and the difference between a warm breakfast on time and a cold house and a crying child and a whole day started wrong. There is a fear that lives alongside the fire too, always, and it is the fear of it getting loose. A house like this is made of dry timber and board and shingle, and the fire at its heart is a living thing that wants to spread, and a stray spark, a log, rolling out onto the floorboards in the night, a chimney lined with years of greasy soot catching light with a roar. Any of these can take the whole house, and everything in it, in minutes, on a windy night, with the nearest help half a mile away. Chimney fires were common and terrifying. Whole families were burned out and left with nothing. Small children, left a moment too near the hearth, were scalded by falling kettles or caught by their clothing, and some died of it, and every mother knew the stories. So your care with the fire is not fussiness. It is the constant, watchful, lifelong discipline of a person living intimately every hour beside the thing that keeps her alive and could at any moment kill her. And you will need a great deal of it. This is a thing that is genuinely difficult for us to grasp. Now, so let me put a number on it. Gently, the only kind of number I will trouble you with. A household like this one, in a climate like this one, with a fireplace that is the only source of heat and the only place to cook, will burn its way through somewhere between 30 and 40 cords of wood in a single year. A cord is a stack of split logs 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long. 30 or 40 of them. It means that a very large part of your husband's entire year and your older son's year is spent felling trees and hauling the trunks and sawing them into lengths and splitting the lengths and stacking the split wood to season so that this fire, your fire, will never go out. Think of what those cords mean in labor, standing behind the simple warmth of this room. A tree must be found and felled with an axe, and the trunk limbed and hauled by the oxen, dragged over the frozen ground of winter when hauling is easiest, and then sawn by hand with a great two-man saw into logs of a length, and then those logs split with an axe and a wedge and a maul, blow after blow, and then the split wood stacked in the long ricks to season, because green wood will not burn well and must dry for the better part of a year before it gives its full heat. The woodpile is a form of wealth, and a well-stocked, well-seasoned woodpile going into winter is a sign of a household in good order and steady hands, the way a full barn is. And a family caught short of wood in a hard winter, burning green or scrounging, is a family in real trouble, cold and struggling. So a large share of the year's outdoor labor, your husband's and your son's, goes to feeding this one fire, and the fire in return does everything. It warms the house, it cooks every meal, it heats the wash water and the bake oven and the soap kettle, it dries the herbs and the wood itself, it lights the winter evenings, it is the sun of this small indoor world. No wonder it is tended like a living thing. In a real sense, it is the life of the house. Everything in this house bends around the fire. The house was built around it. The central chimney is the spine of the whole structure, and the rooms are arranged against it so that its warmth is shared and its weight is carried. And you, kneeling here in the dark coaxing the flame up, are tending the one need without which none of the rest is possible. While the fire takes hold, you can begin to dress properly, and it is worth pausing on what that means, because a woman does not simply throw on a garment and go. Against your skin goes the shift, a long plain linen garment, probably the same one you slept in, because linen worn next to the body is what protects your outer clothes from the sweat and oil of your skin, and it is the shift, not the gown, that will be washed. Over the shift stays a stiffened bodice, laced, that supports your back through a day of lifting and hauling and bending, and that a woman of this time thinks of not as a vanity but as a necessary support, the way you might think of a good pair of boots. Then petticoats, more than one, for warmth. Then a gown or a short, loose jacket called a bedgown, practical, hard-wearing, in wool or linen. Then an apron, always an apron, because you are about to spend the day in the ashes and the grease and the washwater. A cap over your hair which is pinned up and will stay pinned up and covered from now until you go to bed. A grown woman does not go about with her head bare and her hair loose, and you would feel undressed without the cap the way you might feel undressed without your shoes. And on your feet, wool stockings and leather shoes, or in the house perhaps just the stockings, because shoes are precious, and the floor, once the fire is up, will not be so cruel. And even dressed, even with the fire climbing, the house in the cold months is not warm the way we mean it. Only the room with the fire has any real heat in it. And even there it is all at the front, toward the hearth. Your face and your front may be roasting while your back is chilled, which is the whole reason for the high-backed settle that walls off the cold room behind you and holds the blaze close. Away from the hearth, the house is bitter. The chambers are unheated. The loft is freezing. Water left standing in a far corner will skin with ice on a hard night. And so, in winter, the whole life of the family draws in toward the one fire, crowds into the one warm room. lives and works and eats and sleeps within the reach of the hearth, and the far corners of the house are simply surrendered until spring. You dress in layers not for the going out only, but for the staying in, and you are never, in the depth of winter, quite warm all over, and you do not expect to be, and you have never known anything else. Dressed, with the fire climbing, you turn to the water, and here is the next great labour of the day, one that never ends and never lightens. There is no tap, there is no pipe. Every single drop of water that this household will use today, for the porridge and the tea, for the washing of faces and hands and pots, for the animals if the stream is frozen, for the great laundry when the laundry day comes, for the soap and the brewing and the scrubbing of floors, every drop of it must be carried by hand from the well or the spring or the stream into the house in buckets. And water is heavy. A gallon of it weighs 8 pounds, and a household of 6 drinks and cooks and cleans its way through a startling amount of it in a day, and you are the one, mostly, who carries it, or your daughters when they are big enough. And this is why the well or the spring being close to the door is one of the things that decides where a house is built in the first place. Water is wanted for everything, and wanted constantly, and it comes into the house only on your back and your daughters bucket by bucket all day. It is wanted to fill the big pot and the kettle for the porridge and the tea. It is wanted to wash the faces and hands of the household, and to scrub the wooden bowls and the pots after every meal, in more water heated at the fire. It is wanted for the beasts when their trough is dry or the stream is frozen. It is wanted, in floods, on the great days of the wash and the soap-making, when you will carry more of it than you can bear to count. And it is wanted for the scrubbing of the floors, the sanding and scouring of the bare boards, the endless battle against the dirt that a household of 6 and a great open fire, and the mud of a farmyard drag in without cease. So the carrying never stops. If you are fortunate, there is a well close by the door, and over it a well sweep, a tall post with a long pole pivoted across the top of it, a weight on one end, and a bucket on a chain or a wooden rod on the other, so that the great labour of raising a full bucket up out of the deep dark shaft is shared by that swinging counterweight. And you can bring the water up with a pull and a lean, rather than by hauling hand over hand on a rope. You lower the bucket, you hear it strike the black water far below, and tip and gurgle and fill, and then you bring it up, cold and dripping and heavy, and you tip it into the pail you will carry. If there is no well, then there is a spring, or the stream, and you go to it with a wooden yoke across your shoulders, shaped and smooth to sit on the back of your neck and spread the weight, with a pail hanging from each end, and you walk back to the house balancing them, and you will do this again and again and again, all through the day, until you have stopped counting, because counting would only make it heavier. And the water is not only heavy, it is not always safe, and it is not always there. In the hard freeze of a New England winter, the stream ice is over, and the well can freeze at the top, and getting water becomes a battle of its own, breaking ice, thawing buckets by the fire. In a dry summer, the spring can fail, and the water itself, drawn from a shallow well too near the barn or the privy, can carry sickness, though no one in this house understands why. The connection between foul water and the fluxes and fevers that carry off so many children is not yet known. This is one of the quiet reasons that cider and beer are drunk so freely by everyone, all day, children included. Not to be merry, but because a drink that has been fermented is a drink that is safe. And a family that drinks its own cider is a family less often laid low by whatever is in the water. You do not know the science of it. You know only from long observation handed down that the homebrewed drinks sit well and the water sometimes does not, and you act on the knowledge without needing the reason, and every drop that comes in must in some form go out again, and that too is labour. The dishwater, grey and greasy after the scouring of the bowls and pots, is not simply poured away. It may go to the pigs, who thrive on the household slops, for nothing is wasted, not even dirty water if a use remains in it. The wash water, the rinse water, the scrubbing water, all of it hauled in clean and carried out foul day after day, is part of the same unending round, and the woman and her daughters are the ones who carry it both ways in and out, clean and dirty, from the first light to the banking of the fire. It is the plainest and most invisible labour there is, and the most constant, and it underlies every other thing that is done in the house. For there is no cooking, no washing, no cleaning, no brewing, no living without the water. And the water comes only on the backs of the women, one bucket at a time. I want you to feel the ordinariness of that, because we tend to imagine the drama of the past, the wars, the speeches, the great men on horseback, and forget that underneath all of it, holding all of it up, were tens of thousands of women walking back and forth to the water with a yoke on their shoulders, morning and noon and evening, every day of their lives, and thinking nothing of it, and never once expecting to be thanked. The water is simply the beginning. It is the first of the day's endless carryings, the first of the day's endless small tasks. And you do it now, in the thin grey light that is at last beginning to come up behind the eastern hills, while the fire behind you settles into a good steady burn, and the house begins slowly to warm. And now, with fire and water, you can make breakfast and wake the house. Before you can even think of the pot, though, there is the first round of the morning's tending, done in the grey half-light while the fire climbs and the porridge is not yet started. The night's ashes must be dealt with, some saved for the soap-making and the lye, some taken out. The hearth must be swept. If the cows have not yet been milked, they must be, and the milk brought in and strained before anything else, for it will not wait. The hens must be let out and fed, and their eggs gathered. The small child waking must be seen to. The chamber pots must be emptied and rinsed. There is a whole sequence of small necessary tasks folded into the first hour. Before the family is even properly fed, each one a link in the chain that will run unbroken now until nightfall, and you move through them in an order so long practiced that you do not think about it. Your hands and feet, knowing the round of it, the fire tended, the water fetched, the beasts seen to, the ashes cleared, the hearth swept, all before the sun is fully up. And there is a small thing in that clearing of the ashes that shows how tightly every part of this life is bound to every other. The very ashes of the fire that warms and cooks for you are not waste but a resource, gathered and kept in the ash hopper, because from wood ashes comes the lye, and from the lye and the saved fat comes the soap that washes the family and the linen, and comes too the leavening for certain breads and the aid to certain dyeing. The fire gives heat and light and cooking, and then its very leavings give soap and more besides. Nothing serves only once. Nothing is spent and done with. The ash becomes soap, the fat becomes soap and candles, the worn shirt becomes rags, becomes paper, the buttermilk feeds the pigs become the winter's meat and the fat for next year's soap and candles, and round it all goes, in a great turning wheel of use and reuse and nothing wasted, and you stand at the centre of the wheel. The pot goes on. There is an iron crane fixed into the side wall of the fireplace, a bracket you can swing out into the room and swing back over the flames, and from it hang pot hooks and trammels, adjustable iron hangers, notched like a saw, that let you raise a pot higher from the fire or lower it closer so that you can control the heat not by adjusting the flame, which you cannot do, but by moving the pot. This is the whole secret of cooking at an open hearth, and it is a skill that takes years to learn in the body. You have a fire that you cannot turn up or down, and so instead you learn the geography of it, the hot places and the cooler places, the fierce flame and the gentle glowing coals raked out to one side, and you move your pots and pans about that landscape the way a person might move around a garden, knowing which corner catches the sun. Into the big pot goes water, and then cornmeal stirred in slowly against the lumps, and salt, and it is set to bubble and thicken over the fire into the dish that half of America wakes up to on a morning like this. A plain hot cornmeal porridge, called by different names in different houses, mush, hasty pudding, samp eaten with milk poured over it, or with a little molasses stirred through for sweetness, or with butter if the butter is good and plentiful. It is not exciting. It is warm and filling and cheap, and it can be made from what you have, which are the three things that matter most in this kitchen, and it will sit in the stomachs of your family and carry them through a morning of hard physical work. On the days you have set the dough the night before, there will be bread, and perhaps a thin flat cake of cornmeal baked quickly on a board propped before the fire, or on the flat blade of a hoe held to the coals, which is why they call it, plainly enough, a hoe cake. There may be eggs if the hens are laying, which in October they still are. There may be a little salt pork, fried in the long-handled iron pan called a spider, a skillet that stands on 3 legs of its own, so it can sit directly over a heap of coals raked out onto the hearth. There is no coffee on this table, or almost none. That will come later and be pushed along partly by the very quarrel with England that is stirring down in the ports, when tea becomes a thing a patriot will not drink. For now, the morning drink is more likely cider or milk or a thin small beer or a hot drink brewed from herbs or from toasted grain. And the food is plain and it is local, and it changes with the seasons because there is no other way for it to be. In the autumn, like now, there is plenty. The harvest is in or coming in, the animals not yet lean, the garden still giving. In the deep of winter, it narrows to what has been stored and salted and dried. And in the spring, this is the thing we forget, comes the leanest and hungriest time of all, when the stores from last autumn are running low, and the new season has not yet given anything. And a family can go through weeks of thin eating, waiting for the first greens and the first eggs of the lengthening days. The belly of this household keeps time with the turning year, as surely as the fire does. And it is worth pausing on those homely drinks, because the making of them is another of your quiet crafts, and another turn of the year's wheel. The cider is pressed in the autumn from your own apples, barrels of it, and it works and hardens over the winter into something with a kick in it, and it is the everyday drink of the whole family through much of the year, safe and sound and cheering, drunk at every meal and between them. The small beer you brew yourself too, a weak and wholesome brew from malted grain, made in batches and kept, and it is drunk by everyone, the children included, as a matter of plain course, because it nourishes and because it is safe when the water may not be. In the autumn there is the pressing and the brewing to add to everything else. In the cellar the barrels stand in their rows, the cider and the beer and the cured pork and the roots, the whole liquid and solid wealth of the household's provisioning laid up in the cool dark against the year to come. To keep a good cellar was to keep a family secure, and the woman who brewed well and pressed well and cured her meat well was, again, quietly proud of it, as she had every right to be. You do not, most days, eat your meat in neat individual portions the way we do. That is a refinement of richer tables. Here the flesh, when there is any, is very often in the pot, flavouring and enriching a dish of grains and vegetables that stretches a little across many mouths. Salt pork and salt beef, put up in barrels of brine at the autumn butchering, are the backbone of it, soaked before cooking, to draw the fierce brine out. There is a great deal of corn in a dozen forms, because corn is the gift of this land, and it grows where the old European grains struggle. Cornmeal mush, cornbread, hoe cakes, hominy, samp. There is rye, mixed with the corn into the dark heavy loaf that New England ate more than any other, the loaf they called rye and Injun. And over all of it, when you can, butter and milk and molasses, the sweetness that made the plainness bearable. It is a humble diet and a monotonous one by our standards, but it is honest, and it is filling, and it is grown and made within a mile of where it is eaten, and a hungry family coming to it after hard work in the cold finds it very good indeed. While it cooks, you call the children down, and the house comes to life above you. Let me show you the woman you are, for a moment, before the day carries you off, because you will not have time to think of yourself again until you are lying down tonight. You are perhaps in your middle 30s, though you might be taken for older, because the work marks a body early in this world. Your hands are your history, reddened, roughened, the knuckles beginning to thicken, scarred here and there with old burns from the fire and the kettle, strong and quick and never quite still. Your back aches in the mornings, and the aches will deepen with the years. You have borne several children and buried at least one, and your body carries that too. You are not idle, and you are not soft, and you have never in your life had a day of true rest, not one, save the enforced quiet of the Sabbath, and even that is filled with its own duties. And yet you are not, most days, unhappy. There is a deep steadiness in you, a rootedness, that comes of knowing exactly what your work is, and exactly how to do it, and exactly why it matters, of being needed, wholly and unquestionably, by the people you love. You are the still centre of this household. Everything turns on you, and you know it, and there is a quiet strength in that knowledge that the softest life could never give. They sleep in the loft, up under the roof, where in summer it is stifling, and in winter it is so cold that the water in a cup left up there will freeze solid by morning, and where the only warmth is what rises through the boards from the room below. It is the plainest space in the house. Bare boards, a few pallets or rope beds, the coverlets, with nothing between it and the weather but the shingles. There is no privacy as we would know it. Children sleep together for warmth, several to a bed, and think nothing of it. They are dressed, when they are small, much alike, boys and girls both, in simple long gowns until they are breeched. Until a boy is old enough, 4 or 5 or 6, for his first pair of breeches, a real event, a small graduation into boyhood. Their clothes are made down from their elders, and made to be grown into and let out, and handed down the line of siblings. And their days, though full of work from an early age, are not without play folded into them. A game with a hoop or a ball, a doll of rags or corn husk, a whittled top. The games children have always made for themselves out of almost nothing, snatched in the corners of a working day. For children will be children in any century, and a good mother lets them, within reason, because the work will claim them soon enough and for the rest of their lives. They come down the steep stair or the ladder rubbing their eyes, the older ones first, already half into their tasks before they are properly awake, because in this household everyone works and everyone knows from the age of about 4 what is theirs to do. Let me put the family in front of you, so that the house is not empty. There is your husband, up now, and pulling on his boots, a man of middling years, brown and hard-handed, who will be out to the animals within minutes. There is your eldest, a girl of about 14, who is very nearly a second mistress of the house already, who can spin and cook and mind the little ones, and who will marry within a few years and begin all of this again in a house of her own. There is a boy of 11, who belongs more to his father now than to you, who is out with the men in the fields most days. There is a girl of 8, at the age of learning everything, watching you do one task after another with the grave attention of a child who understands that this watching is her schooling. And there is a small one, 3 or 4, always underfoot, always at the edge of danger near that fire, whom you watch with half an eye through everything you do. Every one of these children works, and has worked since they were very small, and this is not thought cruel. It is simply how a family survives, each pair of hands adding what it can. The smallest, the 3-year-old, is set to the easiest things almost as a game, gathering eggs from the hens, shelling peas or beans into a bowl, fetching small things, keeping out from underfoot. By 6 or 7 a child is genuinely useful, carrying water, minding a younger sibling, weeding the garden, feeding the poultry, gathering kindling, turning the spit, picking the wool. By 10 or 12 the division has hardened along the lines the whole society runs on. The boys go out to the fields and the barn with their father, learning the man's work of the farm, while the girls stay with their mother and learn hers. And there is a great deal of it to learn. The 8-year-old girl watching you today is at school, though there is no schoolhouse in it. She is learning to spin, to knit, to sew, to tend the fire, to milk, to know the signs of the dairy and the bake oven, to doctor with herbs, to manage 100 things at once. A full apprenticeship in the running of a household, served at her mother's elbow, that will take her years, and that she will need entire when she has a house of her own before she is 20. And woven through all the practical schooling is another kind entirely, for these are children being raised not only to work, but to be good, in a world that took the state of a child's soul with deep seriousness. They learn their catechism, the questions and answers of the faith, said over until they are known by heart. They are taught to pray, at the bed and at the board. They are taught obedience, and reverence, and industry, and truth-telling, and the fear of God. And these are not thought optional. The raising of a child is the raising of a soul, and a parent who failed in it, failed in the gravest duty there was. Discipline is firm, sometimes hard by our lights, for the age believed a child's will must be bent early toward the good. But under the strictness, in a loving house, is real tenderness, and the children are cherished, prayed over, taught, and loved the more fiercely for the ease with which the world could take them. To raise a child well, hardy in body and sound in soul and skilled in the work of life, and to see it safely grown was the deepest work and the deepest joy a woman had. And it went on beneath every other task of every day, the long patient shaping of the next generation at the mother's side. There may be a little book learning too, in the slack of the winter, when a travelling schoolmaster keeps a term in the district, or a mother teaches her children their letters and their catechism at home by the fire. In New England, where the scriptures mattered to the soul, more people could puzzle out print than in most of the world of that day, women as well as men. But it is thin and interrupted schooling, snatched from the edges of a working life, and for a farm girl it comes a distant second to the great practical education of the household, because it is the household, not the hornbook, that she will live by. And there is one who is not here. On the hill behind the meeting house, in the burying ground, there is a small stone with a name on it, and two dates very close together. A child of yours who did not live past the second summer, and you think of that child more often than you ever say, and you say almost nothing, because everyone you know has such a stone, and grief that is universal is not, in this world, a thing much spoken of. It sits in you quietly. It is part of why you watch the little one by the fire so closely. It is part of the deep, unspoken seriousness underneath all the ordinary bustle of this ordinary day. I will not dwell on it, because you would not. You would set it aside and get on, because the porridge is ready and there are 5 living people to feed. But I did not want to walk you through this whole day and let you believe it was a life without sorrow in it. It was not. It was a life with sorrow folded quietly into the middle of it, and carried and got on with. So you feed them. They gather at the board, the table, on benches and stools, the smallest in your lap or at your side, and you serve out the hot mush into wooden bowls or pewter porringers, and there is milk, and the family bows its head while your husband says a few words of grace, plain and heartfelt, thanking God for the food and the roof and the morning, and then they eat, quickly and without much talk, because the day is waiting. The pewter, if you have it, is your good ware, and it hangs on the dresser and catches the firelight, and is polished and prized and counted among the family's real possessions. A young couple setting up house begins with almost nothing: a few iron pots, a kettle, some wooden bowls and trenchers, the barest necessities, and builds up its store of household goods slowly across the years, a pewter plate at a time, a good chest, a feather bed, a bit of better crockery, so that the well-furnished dresser of an established household represents decades of patient acquiring, and each piece has its history, its cost, its place in the family's rise. To us it would look like almost nothing, a bare shelf of plain metal and wood and coarse earthenware. To her it is the visible wealth of a lifetime's work, ranged on the dresser for all to see, and there is quiet pride in it. Most of what you eat off and cook in and store things in, though, is wood and iron and coarse earthenware, plain and sturdy and made to last a lifetime of hard use. Breakfast eaten, the day breaks open into its 100 tasks, and your husband and the older boy go out to the barn and the fields, and the house becomes, as it is for most of every day, a place of women and small children and endless work. Let me show you the house itself now, in the growing light, because you should be able to see the spaces we are moving through. It is not large. From the outside, it is a plain structure of clapboard weathered to grey, a story and a half, with that one great chimney rising through the middle of the roof. Inside, the heart of it is this room, the hall or the keeping room, where the great fireplace is, where you cook and where the family gathers, and where you and your husband sleep in the built-in bed in the corner. This is the only chamber that is properly warm, and in the coldest months it is where the family really lives at all. Off it there may be a parlour, the best room, kept for the minister's visit and for special occasions, and for laying out the dead, cold and formal and little used. There is a lean-to across the back, the L, where the dairy work is done, and things are stored, where it is cool, which is exactly what you want for the milk and the butter and the cheese. This shaded back place, the buttery or the dairy, is its own small world of stone shelves and shallow pans and crocks and the churn, kept cold on purpose, for the milk must not turn and the butter must not melt. It faces away from the sun, its windows small, its floor perhaps of packed earth or stone that holds the chill. Here the milk stands in its wide pans for the cream to rise. Here the butter is worked, and the cheese is pressed, and the milk things are washed and scalded and set to dry. Here, too, are stored the crocks and the barrels, and whatever keeps best in the chill. It is a working space, plain and functional, one of the woman's own domains, the cool heart of her dairy craft, as the hearth is the hot, bright heart of her cooking. Between the two of them, the cold ell and the warm hall, a large share of a housewife's day is spent, carrying between them the milk in, the butter out, the hot work and the cool, and above, the loft, where the children sleep. That is the whole of it. Into this small space are packed a family of 6, and the entire manufacturing base of their survival, because nearly everything this family uses, it makes in this house with these hands. Look around this hall as the light strengthens, and you can see how little there is in it, by our measure, and how much every single thing is worth. There is the board and its benches and a stool or two, and the great settle, a high-backed wooden bench set near the fire, its back turned to the cold of the room to catch and hold the heat. There is the dresser against the wall, where the pewter and the wooden ware are ranged. There are chests, in which clothing and linen and valuables are kept, for there are few cupboards and no wardrobes. A chest holds a family's textile wealth, and a good chest is itself a thing of value, sometimes carved, sometimes brought as part of a bride's portion. There are the beds, the great one built into the corner, and the trundle that may roll out from under it for a child. There is the spinning wheel, or 2, standing ready. There are the tools of a dozen crafts hung on the walls and the beams, and hanging from those same beams and festooned across the great mantle are the strings of the season's drying and keeping, apples cut and threaded, ropes of onions, bunches of herbs, ears of seed corn, drying slowly in the warmth that rises from the fire. Every object here was made to last a lifetime and beyond, made by hand, by a local craftsman, or by the family itself, mended and mended again, and handed down. There is no clutter of the cheap and the disposable, because nothing here is either. A broken piece is repaired, not replaced. A worn-out garment is cut down for a child, and cut down again, and at the very end its rags are saved, because even rags have worth. They are sold to the ragman, who sells them on to be made into paper. No object reaches the end of its life without every last use being wrung from it. It is a house with almost bare walls by our standards, and a place in which everything matters. And there is a kind of order and dignity in that which our own crowded houses have quite lost. That is the phrase I want to leave with you as we go deeper into the day. Nearly everything this family uses. We are so far now from that life that it is genuinely hard to hold in the mind. We push a button and there is heat. We turn a handle and there is clean water. We open a door and there is food from the far side of the earth at any time of year, needing nothing of us but the money to buy it. For her, every single one of those things is the end of a long chain of labor reaching back through the months, and most of the links in the chain are her own hands. The warmth is the wood her family felled and split and seasoned, and she now burns. The water is what she carried. The bread is the grain her husband grew and the miller ground, and she leavened and kneaded and baked. The meat is the animal they raised and killed and she salted. The clothes are the flax and the fleece grown and spun and woven and cut and sewn. The light is the fat she saved and the candles she dipped. The soap is the ashes and the fat. There is almost nothing in her life that she can simply have. There is only what she and hers can make, from the earth up, by the labor of their own bodies, season upon season. And that is the deep truth of this world. And it is why the work never ends. And it is also, strange as it seems to us, a source of a certain deep satisfaction. For there is a dignity in making the whole of your own life with your own hands that our easy having can never quite give. You do not go to a shop for bread. You grow the grain, or your husband does, and it is ground at the mill, and you bake it. You do not buy soap. You save the fat and the ashes all year, and render it down. You do not buy candles. You save the fat for those too. You do not buy cloth most of the time. You grow the flax and keep the sheep and spin the thread, and have it woven and cut it and sew it. You do not call a doctor. You grow the herbs and you keep the remedies, and you are the doctor. What little does come from outside comes through the shopkeeper in the nearest town, and the way it comes is worth understanding, for it shaped the whole economy of a life. There was scarcely any coin about, hard money being rare, and so trade ran largely on barter and on credit kept in a book. You bring your surplus to the shop, the eggs and butter and cheese beyond what the family needs, the length of cloth you have woven, the yarn you have spun, and it is weighed and valued and set to your credit in the shopkeeper's ledger, and against that credit you draw the few things you cannot make. The salt, without which no meat can be kept, the ironware, the needles and pins and nails, a little sugar and spice and tea for best, perhaps some fine cloth or a ribbon for a best gown. Coin scarcely changes hands at all. It is all reckoned in the book, your wares against his, the balance carried from visit to visit, sometimes for years. And so the woman's making her butter and cheese and cloth and eggs is not only food for her family, but the very currency by which the household buys what it lacks. And a woman who makes well and has a surplus to trade is, in a real and daily sense, bringing wealth into the house, however little the law may credit her with it. But the bulk of daily life, the food and the warmth and the light and the clothing, comes out of this house and this land and your two hands, and that is why the work never stops, and why a woman in this world is not idle for one waking hour from her girlhood to her grave. So let's go out first into the cool of the early morning, to the garden, because some of the day's food is still standing in the ground and must be got before you turn to the business of the midday meal. The kitchen garden is close by the house, fenced against the animals, and even now in October there is a great deal in it. Through the summer, it has been the source of half of what the family eats, and it has been, along with everything else, your responsibility and your daughter's, dug and planted and weeded and watered through all the warm months. There are the tough late cabbages and root crops still in the ground waiting to be lifted and stored against the winter turnips, carrots, parsnips, beets. There are beans that have been left to dry on the vine and will be shelled and kept. There are pumpkins and squashes, orange and heavy, the great keepers of the winter larder that will sit in the cool of the ell for months. There are the last of the herbs, and these matter as much as the food, because your herbs are your medicine chest, sage and thyme and savory for the pot, but also the plants you dry and hang and steep into the tinctures and teas and poultices with which you will doctor this family through every fever and flux and injury of the coming year. You gather what you need for the day, your apron gathered up into a basket, the ground cold and dark under your shoes, your breath showing in the air, the light now properly up and gold across the fields where you can see your husband and your son already at work, small figures against the stubble. And this garden is not only today's food, it is the winter's survival, and a great part of the autumn's work is the putting by, the labour of storing against the cold months when nothing grows. There is a method to every kind of keeping. Learned young, the roots lifted and packed in sand or straw, or buried in a clamp in the earth, the cabbages stored whole in the cool or shredded and salted, the beans and peas dried on the vine and shelled, the apples laid in straw and pressed and cut in rings to dry, the herbs hung in the airy dark. Each thing has its own way of being made to last, and knowing them all is part of the craft. All of this is the housewife's provisioning, the filling of the larder against the long white siege of winter, and a woman who provisions well sees her family through in comfort, and a woman who provisions badly, or is struck by a poor harvest, watches the stores dwindle in February with a real and gnawing fear. The autumn, this very season, is when it is all decided, and so the autumn is a time of ceaseless, driving, urgent work. The harvest, the preserving, the soap and the candles and the butchering all crowding together before the cold, because what is not put by now cannot be had later at any price. Go down, in your mind, into the cellar beneath the house, for it is the treasury of the whole household and the measure of its safety, and a woman's eye goes to it often in the autumn. It is cool and dark and earthen smelling, and its shelves and bins and barrels are filling now, week by week, with the wealth that is not gold but is far more to the point, the barrels of salt pork and salt beef in their brine, the crocks of lard and the tubs of butter salted down, the cheeses aging on their boards, the bins of roots packed in sand, turnips, carrots, parsnips, beets, the heaps of squashes and pumpkins, the apples in their straw, the strings of onions, the crocks of eggs put down for winter, the barrels of cider working in the dark and the small beer beside them, the sacks of meal and flour from the mill. All of it is the summer and autumn's labour turned into stores, the whole year's food and drink laid up against the months when nothing grows and the world is white and shut. And to stand in a full cellar in October is to feel a deep animal security, the certainty that whatever the winter brings, the family will eat, will be warm, will come through. And to stand in a thin one is to feel the opposite, the cold finger of real fear. So the filling of the cellar is the great underlying purpose of all this autumn labour, and the housewife who has filled hers well can face the coming dark with a quiet heart. And then back to the house and to the animals that are yours, because the division of the farm is not that the men do the outdoor work and the women the indoor. It is not so simple as that. The heavy field labour, the ploughing and the mowing and the felling is the men's. But the creatures close to the house are largely yours, the poultry, whose eggs you gather, and whose numbers you tend and thin, and above all the cows, or at least the milking of them, and everything that flows from the milk. And all of this, the garden, the storing, the animals, the work of this very morning, turns on a wheel far larger than the single day, the turning wheel of the year. And a woman lives by that wheel as much as by the daily round. Each part of the year has its own driving labours that cannot be moved. The spring brings the leanest larder and the hardest hunger, and the sowing, and the lambing and the calving, and the great spring cleaning, and the first precious greens. The summer brings the garden in flood, the haymaking, the endless weeding, the first preserving, the shearing of the sheep. The autumn, where we now stand, is the gathering in and the laying by, the harvest and the cider and the butchering and the soap and the candles, the frantic filling of every store before the cold. And the winter is the season of the fireside crafts, the spinning and the weaving and the mending and the making, the time when the outdoor world shuts down and the household turns inward to the wheel and the loom and the needle by the fire, living on what the other seasons put by. If there is an almanac in the house, and there very often is, for the almanac was the one book many households bought each year. It hangs by the hearth, thumbed and consulted, telling the phases of the moon and the turning of the seasons and the days of the fairs and the weather to expect, the one printed thread that tied this farm to the calendar of the wider country. But mostly you do not need it. The year is written in your body, its turns as familiar as your own breath, and you know without being told what each week of it asks of you, because your mother knew, and hers back and back beyond remembering. The poultry are yours too, a little kingdom of their own. The hens must be fed and watered and let out and shut up, their nests searched for eggs each day. The eggs a steady, modest wealth eaten and traded at the shop, and kept in various clever ways to last beyond the laying season, packed in a crock of some preservative against the winter when the hens go off the lay. The broody hens are set on clutches to hatch out the next generation. The surplus cockerels are fattened for the pot. The old hens past laying go, at last, into the stew pot themselves. Ducks and geese, if you keep them, give eggs and meat and feathers, and the feathers matter, plucked and saved and cleaned to fill the precious feather beds and pillows that were among a household's real comforts and real valuables, built up handful by handful over years. It is a small enterprise, the poultry yard, but it is entirely yours, and it turns a steady, modest profit in eggs and birds and feathers, ready money and ready barter. And it is one more of the many small operations that a housewife ran, all at once, all in her head, under the one great roof of her day. For the dairy is the very centre of a housewife's craft, and it is worth slowing right down inside it, because it is beautiful work in its way and endless. You milk the cows morning and evening, sitting on a low stool with your head against the warm flank of the animal in the half-dark of the byre, your hands working in the old steady rhythm, the milk hissing into the wooden pail and rising into a froth. It is one of the few tasks of the day that holds still, that lets your mind wander a little, your cheek against the beast, the smell of hay and hide and warm milk all around you. Then you carry the milk in, more carrying, and you strain it through a cloth to take out the bits of straw and dust, and you pour it into wide, shallow pans of earthenware or wood, and you set those pans on the cool stone shelves of the L, and you leave the milk to stand, so that overnight and through the day the cream will rise slowly to the top, where you can skim it off with a flat wooden skimmer. And the cream you have been skimming and saving becomes butter, and butter making is a labour with a rhythm and a stubbornness all its own. You pour the cream into the churn, an upright wooden barrel with a lid and a tall staff, the dasher, that goes down through a hole in the lid, and then you work that dasher up and down, up and down, up and down for a long stretch. Sometimes a very long one, the cream sloshing and thickening, and there is a small drama in the waiting for the butter, familiar to every woman who ever worked a churn. You work the dasher up and down, and at first nothing seems to happen, the cream only sloshing thickly, and your arms begin to tire, and still nothing, and you work on, and the children ask, "Is it butter yet?" And you say, "Not yet," and you work on. And on a bad day, for reasons you cannot see, the cream too warm or too cold, the weather thundery, some small thing wrong, it simply will not come, work as you may. And this was the occasion of half the old dairy charms and sayings, the little rhymes chanted over the churn, the horseshoe or the crooked sixpence dropped in, the muttered suspicion of a neighbour's ill wish. Because when a thing you have done 1,000 times refuses to happen, and you cannot say why, the mind reaches for a reason, any reason, and the old reasons were nearer to hand than the chemistry no one yet knew, but usually it comes. Usually, after all that steady labour, the sound in the churn changes, and there is butter gathered and worked and salted and pressed into a wooden mould with a pattern carved in the bottom, so that the pat of butter you set on the table or carry to the town to sell or trade comes out stamped with a little wheat sheaf or a cow or a flower, your own mark, the small dignity of a thing well made. What is left, the buttermilk, feeds the family or the pigs, for nothing here is wasted, ever. And some of the milk becomes cheese, pressed and salted and set to age, another long craft, another store against the hungry months. The cheese is a longer patience than the butter. You warm the milk and add rennet, got from the stomach lining of a calf, dried and kept, and the milk sets over a while into a soft, trembling curd, and you cut the curd and let the whey run off, and gather the curd, and salt it, and pack it into a wooden hoop lined with cloth, and set it under the press, a heavy-weighted contraption that squeezes out the last of the whey over hours and days, and then the young cheese must be turned and rubbed and turned again, and left to age on a shelf in the cool, for weeks or months, tended like a living thing, until it is ready. A fine dairywoman's cheese was known and valued for miles, spoken of, asked for, and it was a genuine source of pride and of income, one of the things a woman made with her own skill that carried her name out into the world beyond her door. The dairy was hers in a way little else was, her own small domain of craft and reputation, and the best of them took a real and justified pride in it. All of this, the milking, the setting, the skimming, the churning, the pressing, the turning, runs underneath everything else, every day, morning and evening, because the cows must be milked, whether or not it is convenient, whether or not you are ill, whether or not it is the Sabbath, and the milk will spoil if it is not dealt with. And so the dairy work threads through the whole fabric of the day and the whole round of the year, swelling in the spring when the cows are fresh, and the milk floods in, thinning in the autumn as they dry off toward winter. It is one of the great steady labours, and it is one of the quiet arts, and it belonged, almost everywhere, to the women. By now the morning is well advanced, and the largest work of the day is upon you, which is the midday meal, the dinner, the largest and most important meal of the day, eaten not in the evening as we eat it, but in the early afternoon, around noon or 1 or 2 o'clock, when the men will come in from the fields hungry enough to eat the table itself. The big pot is set going early, in the gaps of the morning's other work, so that it has the slow hours it needs. If there is salt meat in it, that has been soaking since the night before, or since dawn, in a bowl of water changed once or twice, to draw out the fierce brine that would otherwise make the dish too salt to eat, the very salting that preserved it for months must be partly undone before it can be cooked, and knowing how far to soak a given piece is one more matter your hands know without being told. Then the piece goes into the pot with water, and is set over the fire to come to the boil, and then settle back to a slow simmer on the crane, hung high where the heat is gentle. And through the morning the rest goes in its order, the roots and dried beans and barley that need long cooking first, and the quicker things later, the greens and the herbs toward the end, so that all of it comes ready together at the dinner hour. A whole meal built up in one vessel across a whole morning, tended with no more than an occasional stir and a lift or lowering on the trammel. It asks foresight and timing, and a knowledge of how each thing cooks, and it gives back, at the end, a hot and savoury and nourishing dinner made almost without watching, which is exactly the miracle a busy woman needs. And the genius of how you cook it, genius forced on you by circumstance, but genius all the same, is the single pot you have a fire you cannot easily regulate, and you have your 2 hands and 100 other tasks to do. And so the heart of dinner, most days, is one great iron pot hanging on the crane over the fire, in which a stew or a pottage simmers slowly through the morning, needing only an occasional stir. Into it goes whatever the day and the season provide, a piece of salt beef or pork, soaked to draw the brine, and then the vegetables from your garden and your store, the beans, the roots, the cabbage, an onion, dried peas, and perhaps barley or corn to thicken it, and herbs, and it cooks itself quietly, filling the house with its smell while you get on with all the rest. And do not imagine, because it is one pot, that it is one dull thing. A good cook coaxed real variety out of that pot and that hearth across the turning year. There were the great boiled dinners of salt meat and root vegetables and cabbage. There were the pottages and porridges thick with beans and barley and corn. There were the chowders when fish could be had, layered and simmered. There were the pies, not sweet pies only, but great savoury pies of meat and vegetables under a sturdy crust, which travelled and kept and fed many. There were bean porridges left to freeze in the cold and cut off in chunks to be warmed as needed. There were the puddings, plain and sweetened, boiled and baked. And over all of it, the seasonings of the garden and the store, the herbs, the onions, a little precious pepper or spice kept for best, the salt, the molasses, the vinegar you fermented yourself from cider gone hard, from plain and monotonous materials. By skill and long practice and the clever use of what the season gave, a skilled housewife set a table that was nourishing and various enough, and did it day after day, year after year, without recipe books, without measures, without waste, and made it look like nothing, which is the surest sign of a true art. This is the deep logic of the one-pot meal. It feeds many, it uses what you have, it wastes nothing, and above all, it does not chain you to the fire, because you cannot afford to be chained to the fire. There is soap to be made, and thread to be spun, and a child to be watched and water to be carried, and the dinner must, so far as possible, look after itself. On a grander day, or a Sunday when a joint could be spared, there is roasting, and roasting at an open hearth is its own performance. The meat is threaded onto a long iron spit and set on brackets before the fire, not over it, but before it, facing the blaze, and it must be turned steadily for hours so that it cooks evenly on every side, and a dripping pan set beneath catches the fat and the juices, which are precious and will baste the meat and flavour, a sauce and waste nothing. In a poorer house, a child turns the spit by hand, a hot and tedious and much resented job. In a better off one there is a clockwork jack, a weighted mechanism mounted above the hearth that turns the spit on its own, ticking away like a great slow clock, one of the small marvels of the kitchen, and a family that has one of the newer clever things, a reflector oven, a curved box of shining tin set open side to the fire, can roast a bird or bake a batch inside it, the tin throwing the fire's glow back onto the food from every side, a modern convenience that some proud housewife has lately acquired and shown off to her neighbours. But most days are one-pot days, and the true art of the hearth, the skill that takes years to live into the body, is the knowing of the fire's landscape. You come to know it the way you know the rooms of your own house in the dark. Directly under the flames is a fierce blaze for a fast boil. A little to the side, hung higher on the trammel, is a milder heat for a long simmer. Out on the open hearth, in a heap of glowing coals raked away from the main blaze, is a steady, even warmth for the spider and the skillet, or for a small pot on a trivet. You do not turn a dial. You move your food about this map of flame closer and further, higher and lower, all morning by feel and by long knowledge, and a skilled woman keeps 3 or 4 dishes going at once at their different points, all in her head, while she also spins and minds a child and answers the door. It is a quiet mastery that no one ever praised and everyone simply expected, and it would defeat almost any one of us dropped into that kitchen cold. And there is a trick within the trick which I have always loved. You can make the pudding in the same pot as the stew. You take a cloth, a pudding bag, and into it you put a batter or a dough cornmeal and molasses perhaps, or suet and dried fruit if it is a good day, and you tie it up tight and you lower it into the same bubbling pot, or hang it in the steam above, and it cooks alongside the savoury dinner. One fire, one pot, two courses, and when it comes out it is turned from its cloth, dark and dense and steaming, and it is pudding, and the children's faces light at the sight of it. One fire, one pot, a whole meal. There is a kind of quiet brilliance in it that no cookery book taught you, that was simply handed down, mother to daughter, the accumulated cleverness of women making much out of little for 100 generations. But not every day is a stew day, because once a week, or thereabouts, comes the baking, and baking day changes the whole shape of the morning, and it is worth stepping into, because it asks of you a skill that would defeat most of us entirely. You do not have an oven with a dial. What you have, set into the thick brickwork beside the great fireplace, or sometimes built as a little domed structure of its own out in the yard, is the bake oven, a chamber of brick shaped like a beehive inside, with a single opening and a door and no chimney of its own. And to bake in it, you must first drive the very bricks themselves to a fierce, even, lasting warmth. And you do this by building a blaze inside the oven and letting it burn, feeding it for an hour or two or more, until the whole brick chamber is soaked through and the soot on the inner walls has burned away white, which is one of the signs you learn to know. Then, and this is the part that takes real skill, you rake out all the fire, every ember, sweep the oven floor clean with a damp broom kept for the purpose, and you are left with a chamber holding nothing but stored warmth, one you cannot measure with any instrument already, from that moment, beginning to fade. And the bread itself began the night before, or in the small hours, because bread is not quick. You keep back a piece of the last batch's risen dough, or a little of the balm from the beer brewing, as your leaven, your living seed of yeast, and you mix it into flour and water to make a sponge, and you leave it, covered and warm near the banked fire, to work and bubble and rise through the night. In the morning you mix in more flour, the wheat flour if you have it, but more often the mingled rye and cornmeal that made the dark, heavy daily loaf of this country, and salt, and you knead it. And kneading a great batch of stiff dough is hard work for the arms and the back, pushing and folding and turning, and then you set it to rise again while the oven heats. Only when it has risen do you shape the loaves and slide them, on the long-handled wooden peel, into the roaring heat of the swept oven, and shut the door, and wait, and judge again by smell and by the sound a loaf makes when you tap it. For there is no glass to look through, and no light inside. Not every house had an oven of its own, either. And here again the neighbourliness of this world showed itself. A family without a good bake-oven might carry its risen dough to a neighbour's on her baking day, to bake in the borrowed heat once her own loaves were in, or share the firing of a better-off household's oven, for it made no sense to fire two ovens when one, once hot, could bake for several families. So baking day could be a shared day, the women's dough gathered at the one hot oven, the labour and the precious heat, and the news all shared together, another of the small threads that bound the households of a district into one working community. Even the bread, that most basic thing, was often made in company, by women helping women, at the one warm oven. A week's bread, baked in one long day, then had to keep a week, growing steadily staler, and nothing wasted. The fresh bread of baking day was a small feast. The stale bread of the week's end was toasted or soaked or crumbled into other dishes, or made into a pudding, so that not a crust was thrown out. This is the deep rhythm of the household's food, the weekly baking that fired the oven once and made it do the work of 7 days, the loaf that started fresh and ended hard and was used to the last dry crumb. And the woman who baked good bread, week after week, from the plain materials she had, feeding her family well on little, was proud of it, and rightly, for it was one of the plainest and most necessary of all her arts. And now you must judge it. There is no thermometer, there is no number. There is only your hand and your experience. You hold your bare arm into the oven's mouth and count how long you can bear it. Or you throw in a scatter of flour or a scrap of paper and watch how fast it browns. And by these rough and bodily signs, you know whether the oven is fierce enough for bread and pastry, or whether it has cooled to the gentler warmth that suits puddings and custards. And because it only fades, you bake in a strict order. Hottest things first, the bread going in while the oven still roars, then the pies and the pastries as it settles, then the puddings and the beans and the slow, gentle things that will sit for hours in the falling warmth, so that a single heating of that oven, which took half your morning and a good armful of precious wood, is made to do the whole week's baking in one long descending run. It is, when you think about it, an astonishing piece of practical mastery, performed by women who could very often not so much as sign their own name, judging temperatures to a nicety, with nothing but the skin of their forearm and 40 years of doing it. If the sounds of this day are one way into it, the smells are another, and they mark the hours as surely as any clock. The cold, clean smell of the dawn air and the first wood smoke, the porridge and the bacon of the morning. Through the forenoon, the deep, savoury breath of the dinner pot, filling the house for hours. On a washing day, the sharp bite of lye and hot, wet linen. On a soap day, the heavy reek of the boiling kettle. On a butchering day, the iron smell of the work, and then the sweet smoke of the curing hams. The barn and the byre and the warm animal smell of the milking. The tallow when the candles are dipped. The cidery sweetness of the cellar. And threaded through all of it, morning to night, day upon day, the one constant that underlies them all, the smell of wood smoke and the fire, so deep in the timbers and the clothes and the hair of everyone in the house that no one who lives there can smell it at all, and only a stranger, coming in from the road, notices it and knows at once that here is a house that is lived in, and warm and alive. And the smell of it, the smell of new bread coming out of that oven into the cool of the morning, is one of the finest smells of this whole world, and it fills the house, and it means, more than almost anything else, that all is well, that there will be food, that the week is provided for. While some things bake and the big pot simmers, though, there is other heavy work that comes round on its own harder rhythm, and the hardest of all, the one every woman dreaded, was the wash. You do not do laundry every day. You could not possibly, it is far too much labour. In a household with enough linen, the wash might come round once a week, or once a fortnight, or in some houses only a few times a year for the truly big washes. And this is one of the reasons a family valued having plenty of shifts and shirts and sheets, not for show, but so that the terrible day of the wash could be put off as long as possible. And when it comes, it swallows the whole day, from before dawn until dark, and often more than one day, and it is done outside when the weather allows, in the yard, around a roaring fire and a great kettle. And before any of that, there is the sorting, for you do not wash everything alike. The bulk of the wash is the body linen, the shifts and shirts worn next the skin, the caps, the aprons, the sheets and pillowcases and table linen, all of it white or near it, all of it linen, and it is this that takes the hot lye and the boiling and the hard scrubbing, because it is this that must come out clean and white. The good outer garments of wool and silk are hardly washed at all. They are brushed and aired, and sponged where they are marked, and spot cleaned, but not plunged in the wash, because water and lye would ruin them. And this is exactly why the linen worn underneath mattered so much, and was changed and washed while the fine clothes over it were spared, and why so much fine clothing of that age survives to be seen in museums now, having been so rarely washed. The coloured cottons, the calicoes, must be handled gentler still, washed cool and quick without the lye that would strip their dye, sometimes with a little something added to the water to hold the colour fast. So the wash is not one task but several, sorted and handled each, in its own way, by knowledge handed down, and the getting of it wrong, the good gown shrunk, the colours run, the linen yellowed, was a small disaster of real cost in a world where cloth was so dear. You begin as ever by hauling wood and hauling water, a great deal of both, far more than usual, because you must fill that big iron kettle again and again. You light the fire under it in the yard, and the dirtiest things, the body linen worn against the skin, you have very often set to soak the night before, sometimes in plain water, sometimes in something stronger, in a lye made from wood ashes, or, and I will tell you this plainly, because it is simply the truth of how it was done, in stale urine kept for the purpose, saved in a tub, because the ammonia in it cuts grease and lifts stains and sets certain dyes, and nothing in this world was too precious or too humble to be put to use. This soaking was called bucking. Then the boiling. The linen goes into the hot kettle, and you push it and lift it and turn it with a long wooden stick, a battling stick, agitating it in the hot soapy water, and then you haul each heavy, scalding, dripping piece out and into a tub, and you scrub at the stubborn spots, and you rinse and you wring and wringing a soaked linen sheet by hand, twisting the water out of it, is a labour that will make your forearms burn and your back ache. And then you carry it all, wet and heavy, to spread on the bushes or the grass or over a line or a fence to dry in the wind and the pale autumn sun. And then the next load. And the pressing and the smoothing to come after. It is brutal, honest, unglamorous work, and the women who did it, week after week, year after year, wore it in their bodies, in bent backs and swollen knuckles, and asked for no pity, and got none, and simply did it, because it had to be done, and there was no one else to do it. And the wash does not end with the washing. Once the linen is spread on the bushes and the grass and the fences and the line, it must dry. And drying is at the mercy of the weather. A fine breezy day is a gift, a wet week a disaster that leaves damp linen hanging about the house for days. Bleaching, too, belonged to it, the whitening of linen by laying it out on the grass in the sun, sprinkled and turned, day after day, so that the light and the air drew it white, a slow, patient art. And then, when it is dry, comes the smoothing, the pressing, done with heavy flat irons made hot at the fire. You keep two or more, so that one warms while the other works, and you test it against your cheek, or with a wet fingertip that hisses, and you press the linen smooth on a padded board, changing the irons as they cool, back and forth to the fire, for a long time. To iron a household's worth of shifts and shirts and caps and aprons and sheets, by hand, with an iron heated at the hearth, is a labour that ran into a second full day, and it is why the whole terrible business of the wash was dreaded and postponed, and when it could be shared, several women coming together to help one another through it, turning the worst day of the household round into something more bearable by doing it in company. And the soap you wash with, you made yourself on another hard day earlier in the year, and it is worth telling how, because it joins two of the great cycles of the household into one and shows you how nothing was ever wasted. All year, you have saved fat. Every scrap of grease from the cooking, every trimming of tallow from the animals killed in the autumn butchering has gone into a crock, kept hoarded, and all year you have saved wood ashes from the fire, that same endless fire, packed into a barrel or a special ash hopper. When soap-making day comes, usually in the autumn when the butchering gives you fat in plenty, you pour water slowly through the barrel of ashes again and again, and what trickles out the bottom is lye, a harsh caustic liquid, strong enough to burn your skin, and there is a rough old test for whether it is strong enough. You float an egg in it, and if the egg rides high enough that a small circle of shell shows above the surface, the lye will do. Then you boil the lye and the saved fat together in the great kettle, out in the yard over a fire, for hours and hours stirring, and it is dangerous, hot, splashing, caustic work, and slowly the fat and the lye combine and thicken into soap. Soft soap, most often, a brown jelly, you keep in a barrel and scoop out as needed, rather than the hard cakes we know. There were superstitions all around it, as there were around butter, that the moon must be right, that you must stir only one way, that only a certain kind of stick would do, and you can smile at that if you like, but stand for a day over a kettle of boiling lye and fat, watching it stubbornly refuse to come together for reasons you cannot see, and you will understand exactly why a woman reached for a charm. When you cannot command a thing and you cannot explain it, you appease it. It is a very human answer to a very hard day. It is worth dwelling for a moment on how much foresight this one product demanded, because it tells you how a whole household had to think. To make soap in the autumn, you must have been saving all year. Every ounce of grease skimmed from the pot, every scrap of fat trimmed in the kitchen, every bit of tallow from the last butchering, hoarded month after month in a crock against this day. And you must have been keeping the wood ashes too, all through the year's burning, packed into the ash hopper or the leaching barrel, kept dry, waiting. So the soap of October began, in truth, the previous November, in 1,000 small acts of not wasting spread across the whole turning year. And this is the deep habit of mind of the successful housewife. She is always, in everything, thinking a season or two ahead, saving today what will be needed months from now, because there is no shop to run to and no way to conjure a thing at need. The larder, the soap crock, the ash barrel, the wood pile, the candle box, all of them must be filled in advance by patience and foresight, or the want of them will be felt at the worst possible time. And the making itself, on the day, is genuinely dangerous, and I would not have you picture it as anything gentle. Strong lye will blind you if it splashes in the eye and burn you where it touches the skin, and you are handling it hot, in quantity, over a fire, stirring a great kettle for hours, the caustic steam rising into your face. Women were burned at it. It was one of the hard, hazardous, deeply unglamorous jobs of the year, and it was women's work, and it was simply done, because the household could not do without soap, and there was no one else to make it. The soft brown jelly soap that came of it went into a barrel and was scooped out as needed for the wash and the scrubbing. A harder soap, that could be cut into cakes, needed salt added and more skill still, and was more prized. Either way, it was a full day's dangerous labour for a store of something we now buy without a thought, and never once picture the kettle, and the lye, and the woman stirring. And from that same saved fat, that same autumn tallow, comes your light, because you make your candles too. And this is another all-day labour, usually of the late autumn, that fills the house with the heavy smell of melting tallow. There are two ways. The slow way is dipping. You take rods, each hung with a row of wicks. The wicks spun from cotton or flax, or made from the dried silky down of the milkweed pod gathered from the roadsides, and you dip them into a deep kettle of hot melted tallow, and lift them out and let them set, and dip them again, and lift and set and dip over and over, hour upon hour, each dip adding one more thin layer, until slowly, coat by patient coat, a candle builds up around each wick. It is a long, cold, greasy, patient day, the dipping. The tallow must be melted and kept just at the right heat in a deep kettle, too hot and it will not build on the wick, too chill and it clots and lumps, and you dip the rows of wicks and hang them to cool and dip again. And the cooling takes time, so that you work down a line of hanging rods, dipping the first while the last cools, round and round, dip after dip, the candles thickening a thin coat at a time, the whole house smelling of hot mutton fat. A day's work might yield candles enough for months, and they are stored carefully, away from the mice that love the tallow, and doled out through the dark half of the year with a careful hand. The faster way, if you have the moulds, is to set the wicks in pewter tubes and pour the tallow in and let it set, 6 or a dozen candles at a time. Either way, it is a long day's work for a store of light that must last, and so it is never wasted. You do not, as we do, flood a room at the touch of a finger. You have one candle or two lit only when the last of the daylight has truly gone, and the family gathers close around that single small flame while the corners stay dark, and you learn to do fine work, the sewing, the mending, in that pool of gold or by the fire itself. Tallow candles are smoky, and they smell and they gutter, and the good wax candles that burn clean and bright are a luxury for the rich. Yours are tallow, and you are glad of them, and you measure them out by the inch. There is a finer candle if you are lucky enough to have the bushes for it, made from the waxy grey berries of the bayberry, gathered in autumn and boiled so that the wax rises and is skimmed off the water. A bayberry candle burns cleaner than tallow, with far less smoke and smell, and gives off, when it is pinched out, a faint sweet fragrance that people loved. And there was a saying that a bayberry candle burned to the socket brought luck and health to the house. But the berries are laborious to gather and give up their wax grudgingly, and so bayberry candles are saved for best, for the parlour, for a special evening, while the everyday light is the humble smoky tallow. And below even the tallow candle, in the poorest houses, is the rushlight, a rush stripped and dried and dipped in fat, clamped in an iron holder that burns with a small mean flame for a short time and must be replaced again and again, the very cheapest light there is. What all of this means taken together is that darkness in this world is real in a way we can hardly imagine, we who banish it with a fingertip. When the sun goes down, the black comes into the house and stays, held back only by the fire and by one or two carefully rationed small flames. The long winter evenings are lived mostly in firelight and shadow. You learn to do a great deal by feel and to do your finest work, the close sewing, the fine mending in the daylight while you have it, or huddled near the one candle, or right at the hearth in the flicker of the flames. The night is not the lit and busy thing it is for us. It is dark, and it is early to bed, because there is little to do in the dark, and the tallow must be saved, and because you will be up before the light at the fire. And now let me set the heaviest work aside for a while, and put you where a woman of this house spent more of her hours than almost anywhere else, at a task so constant that it became the very picture of domestic womanhood. The spinning wheel. Cloth is precious. Every thread of it begins as a plant or an animal. The flax must be grown and pulled and rotted and beaten and combed, a whole punishing sequence of processes, before it will yield the long fibers that are spun into linen thread. The wool must be sheared from the sheep and washed and carded, combed out between a pair of paddles set with wire teeth until the tangled fleece becomes soft, even rolls ready for spinning. And then the spinning itself, the turning of that shapeless fiber into strong continuous thread, is done at the wheel, and it is work that never ends, because a household needs an enormous quantity of thread for the everyday linen and woolen cloth called homespun that clothes the whole family, for sheets, for towels, for sacks, for the very rags that will one day be saved. So you spin whenever your hands are free of anything else. You spin in the gaps of the day. You spin in the evening by the fire. There is, for all its endlessness, a real peace in the spinning, and it is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the few tasks of the day that lets the mind go free while the hands work. The wheel hums its low, steady note. The fibre draws out and twists and winds on. The foot works the treadle in a rhythm. The body keeps without thought, and the mind is loose to wander, to think, to remember, to pray, to grieve, to plan, while the thread lengthens and the work goes forward all the same. Women spun together too of an afternoon or evening, gathering to work and talk at once, and the spinning bee was a real pleasure. The wheels going and the tongues going and the thread piling up. And the quantity a household needed was enormous, almost past believing thread for the everyday cloth, and for the sheets and towels and sacks, and for the mending, and for the knitting, spun a little at a time in every free hour of every day, for the whole of a woman's working life. It was the most constant of all the household's crafts, so constant that the very picture of a virtuous woman, in the mind of that age, was a woman at her wheel, industrious, unidle, her hands busy and her thread lengthening, turning the raw stuff of plant and fleece into the cloth that clothed everyone. An unmarried woman who spins is called, in the language of the law and the parish, a spinster, and the word will long outlive the world that made it. And if you stopped for once and simply listened, you would hear the whole day in its sounds. For this is a quiet age, and every sound carries the crackle and settle of the fire, the creak of the well sweep and the splash far below, the lowing of the cows and the fuss of the hens in the yard, the thud of an axe from the woodlot, and further off the ring of a neighbour's, faint across the fields, the wind in the eaves and the trees, the voices of the children, and the psalm sung of an evening, and the bell from the meeting house on the days it rings out over the valley. There is no engine anywhere, no motor, no hum of wires. The loudest thing for miles might be a cart on the road, or a dog barking, or thunder coming up behind the hills. It is a place of small natural sounds, and you have listened to it all your life without ever calling it quiet, because to you it is simply the sound of the day going on, the sound of a world at work by hand. The wheel hums, your foot works the treadle, or your hand turns the great wheel. The fibre draws out and twists and winds on, and it is rhythmic and almost restful and utterly endless. And the sound of it, that low, steady hum and click, was the sound of the American home, in the daytime, more than any other sound there was. And spinning is only the middle of a very long road that runs from a growing plant to a shirt on a child's back, and it is worth seeing the whole of it, because it shows you how much labor lay behind a single garment in a world where nothing came ready-made. Take the flax. It is sown in the spring, grown, and pulled up by the roots in high summer. Then it must be rippled to strip the seeds, and retted, left to rot in water or dew for weeks, until the woody outer stalk breaks down, and dried, and then broken on a wooden brake to shatter that woody core, and scutched, beaten with a wooden blade to knock the broken bits away, and heckled, drawn again and again through beds of iron spikes to comb the fibres straight and fine. Only then, after all of that, is the flax ready to be spun into linen thread. The wool is a different but equally long road, sheared, washed, picked clean, carded into soft rolls, and then spun. And after the spinning, the thread must be woven on a loom, and a loom is a great wooden machine so large it needs a room or a corner of its own. And weaving is a slower and more skilled art than spinning, done sometimes by the women of the house, and sometimes by a travelling weaver who went from farm to farm. And the finished cloth might be dyed, in a pot of colour drawn from the plants of the garden and the roadside and the woods, indigo for blue, madder for red, walnut hulls for brown, goldenrod and onion skins for yellow, the whole palette of a homespun family's clothing coming out of the same earth as its food. This is what lies behind the plain brown and grey and blue homespun that this family wears. Not a purchase, but a year's worth of a woman's and a household's labour, from seed and fleece to the shirt on the back. And this is why, when the quarrel with England deepened in the years just ahead, homespun became something more than cloth. When patriots agreed to stop buying fine English goods in protest, the plain homespun a family made for itself became a badge of principle, a thing to be worn proudly in place of imported finery, and spinning bees were held where women spun together in public as an act of open political defiance. The humble wheel in the corner turned, for a few strange years, into an instrument of revolution. But that is coming, and it is not here yet. Today the wheel hums for the oldest reason of all, because the family needs cloth, and cloth begins here, at your hands. And into the middle of that spinning, that steady humming afternoon, comes the thing that could not be planned for and could not be put off. One of the children is unwell. The small one is flushed and fretful and will not settle, and has a fever, and here is where you become the thing that a housewife of this time had to be, above and beyond everything else, because there was no other. You become the doctor. There is no physician within easy reach, and even if there were, you might not send for him, because he costs money you do not have, and because his remedies, the bleeding and the blistering and the violent purging, are as likely to harm as to help, and you know it. So the care of the sick falls to you, and you have been preparing for it all year without ever calling it that. In the drying of those herbs, in the recipes carried in your head, in the still-room knowledge passed to you by your own mother, you know which herb steeped as a tea will bring down a fever, and which will settle a griping stomach, and which will ease a cough. You know how to make a poultice for a swelling, a syrup for a sore throat, a salve for a burn, and burns are common, terribly common, in a world of open fires and boiling kettles and small children underfoot. And there is a real and constant fear in you all day, every day, of the child and the fire, of the kettle of scalding water, of the pot that could be pulled from the crane. Let me tell you a little of what is in your store of knowledge, because it is real knowledge, hard-won and handed down, and not to be scorned. For a fever, you might steep feverfew, or make a tea of boneset, or elder. For a cough or a sore throat, a syrup of horehound, or honey and vinegar, or an onion sliced and sugared to draw out its juice. For a griping stomach, mint or chamomile or ginger. For wounds and swellings, a poultice, of bread and milk, of comfrey, of plantain leaf crushed and laid on a sting or a cut. For aches, a liniment rubbed in warm. You keep your dried herbs hung in bunches and stored in labelled crocks, and the recipes live in your head, and perhaps in a few pages of a book handed down from your mother, written in her hand, added to in yours. Some of it is sound, genuinely effective, the accumulated plant medicine of centuries. Some of it is useless, and some of it is charm and superstition dressed as physic. But it is what stands between your family and the illnesses that come, and you are its keeper. All of this knowledge had to be gathered as well as kept, and the gathering of it was its own quiet strand of the year. Through the growing season, you watched for your simples, the healing plants, in the garden and the hedgerow and the meadow and the wood, and you learned where each grew and when it stood at its best. And you cut them at the right moon and the right hour by the old law, and hung them to dry in the airy dark, and stored them, and made from them, in their season, the tinctures and syrups and salves and dried stores that filled your medicine shelf. A woman skilled in this was a real resource to her whole neighborhood, sent for in trouble, trusted, and the line between the good housewife with her herb lore and the wise woman or the granny woman consulted for miles around was not a sharp one. It was all part of the same body of women's knowledge, handed down mother to daughter, part sound herbal medicine, part midwifery, part old charm and half-remembered ritual, the accumulated healing wisdom of generations of women who had no doctors, and so became their own. It was knowledge with real power in it and real limits, and you held both, and you know its limits because you have met them. There are sicknesses that all your herbs cannot touch, that sweep through the parishes and take the children, the throat distemper that chokes them, the bloody flux, the fevers, and above all the smallpox, the terror that could scar for life those it did not kill and empty a household in a fortnight. The loss of children was woven into the very expectation of a life. A woman might bear 8 or 9 and expect, quite matter-of-factly and quite heartbrokenly, to bury 2 or 3 of them small. This is the shadow that lies under all the warmth of this house, the thing behind the little stone on the hill, and it is why your care of a feverish child, even a mildly feverish one, has an edge of watchfulness to it that never quite leaves you. You have learned, as every mother of that world learned, to love fiercely and to hold loosely, to give everything and to be ready, always in some deep-braced corner of yourself, for the worst. It is perhaps the hardest thing about this whole hard life, and it was born, mostly, in silence, and got on with, because it had to be. You gather the child up, you steep the herb. You hold the small hot body against you, and you sit for a while, and the spinning stops and everything stops, because this, in the end, is what the whole day of labor is for. These people, this family, kept fed and warm and alive. You will watch through the night if you must. Most times the fever breaks and the child mends. Sometimes, as you know from the stone on the hill, it does not, and there is nothing in your still room or in any physician's bag in the whole colony that can change it, and you live always with that knowledge, quietly, underneath. But today the fever is small, and you have caught it early, and the child grows drowsy against you and sleeps, and after a while you can lay the little one down and go back, gently, to the wheel. And then the men come in from the fields, and it is time for the great meal of the day. They come in at midday or a little after, your husband and your son, hungry with the deep hunger of hard physical labor in cold air, their boots heavy with the mud of the fields, and they wash at the basin by the door and sit to the board, and now the pot that has been simmering all morning gives up its harvest. You ladle out the stew thick and hot and savoury into the bowls with bread if it is a baking week, and there is cider to drink, cider, not water, for much of the year, because cider from your own apples is safe and keeps and cheers, and small beer too, weak and nourishing, drunk by everyone including the children, because the water is not always to be trusted, and because these mild home-brewed drinks are simply what people drink, all day, as a matter of course. There is a shape and a seriousness to this meal that the others lack, for it is the one time in the day the whole household sits down together, and it is not taken carelessly. The family gathers at the board, each in his place, the father at the head, the mother near the hearth end where she can serve and rise to tend the pot, the children ranged along the benches by age, and before a bite is taken, every head bows, and the father speaks the grace, plain words of thanks for the food and the day, and no one begins before it is said. Then the eating, and there is not the free chatter we allow. Children are taught to be quiet and mannerly at the table, to speak when spoken to take what they are given and be thankful, for the raising of children in this world is strict, and the table is one of the schools of it. But there is warmth under the discipline, and the food is good and hot, and there is enough of it, and the family is whole and together for this 1 hour in the middle of the working day, and that is itself a kind of grace beyond the spoken one. Then the men rise and go back out to the light that is already thinking of failing, and the moment closes, and the house returns to its labor. But the memory of the gathered table carries them all through the afternoon. And if it has been a lucky morning, there is that pudding, turned out of its cloth, dark and sweet, and the meal for once is not hurried quite so much, because the middle of the day is the one time the whole family is gathered and fed at ease, and there is a little talk of the fields, of a neighbor, of the beast that is off its feed, of the weather turning, and of whether the frost will hold off long enough to get the last of the work done, and of the butchering to come, and of 100 small matters of the farm and the season that are the whole substance of their shared life, before the men push back from the table and go out again into the afternoon, and the house returns to its women and its work. And while they eat you here in their talk, the other half of this farm's life, the half that goes on out of doors and is not yours but touches everything you do. The autumn is the hinge of the whole farming year, and the men are driving hard through it. The grain is being cut and threshed, beaten out on the barn floor with jointed wooden flails, and winnowed, tossed in the air, so the breeze carries off the chaff, and hauled to the mill to be ground into the flour and meal that will feed you all winter. The corn is being harvested and husked, sometimes at a husking bee where the neighbours gather to strip the ears in a single companionable evening. The apples are in, and the cider press is working. And soon, as the cold comes down hard enough to keep the meat, will come the butchering, the killing of the hogs and a beast or two, the bloodiest and busiest few days of the year, when the whole household turns to the great work of turning living animals into the salted and smoked and rendered stores that will carry everyone through to spring, and that butchering is where your fat for the soap and the candles comes from, and your barrels of salt pork, so that the men's work and your work are not two things but one thing, braided together, each depending on the other. You listen to their talk of the fields with half an ear, filing it away, because what happens out of doors decides what you will have to work with in here. The butchering, when it comes in a week or two, will be the hardest few days of your autumn, and yours as much as theirs. For the killing is the men's, but nearly everything after is women's work. When the hogs are killed and the beast is felled, there follows a furious labour that cannot wait, because fresh meat spoils, and every scrap of it must be dealt with at once. The flesh is cut and salted down in barrels of brine, or rubbed and hung in the smokehouse over a slow smouldering fire for days to cure, into the hams and bacon that will feed you through the year. The fat is rendered tried out in great kettles into lard for cooking, tallow for your soap and candles. The odd bits, the head and the feet and the offal, are turned into head cheese and sausage and scrapple and puddings, for nothing of the animal is wasted, nothing at all, from the meat to the bristles. It is bloody, exhausting, urgent work, done in the cold so it will keep, all hands to it from dawn to dark for days on end, and at the end of it the barrels are full, and the smokehouse is hung, and the crocks of fat are stored, and the family's winter of eating is secured, and you can straighten your aching back and know that the worst and most important labour of the whole year is behind you. That is a week or two off yet. But it is coming, and it stands behind this ordinary day like a mountain behind a hill, and half of what you do today, the saving of the fat, the making of room in the cellar, the readying of the barrels and the crocks is quiet preparation for it. The afternoon is for the 100 smaller things, the mending and the making and the tending, and for something that we would hardly recognize as work at all, but which was one of the most important skills a woman had, the keeping of the whole vast household economy in her head. There is the cleaning too, which never ends and shows for so little. The floors are bare board, and they are scrubbed and scoured with sand and water, and a stiff brush on hands and knees, the sand scattered and worked and swept up dirty, and in the best houses a fresh scatter of clean sand left down, sometimes swept into patterns to catch the next day's dirt. The hearth is swept many times a day. The pewter must be scoured to keep its shine, rubbed with fine ash or sand until it gleams on the dresser. The pots and kettles, black with soot outside and greasy within, must be scoured after every use. Dust and ash and mud and grease are the constant enemies of a house with an open fire and an earthen yard and no easy water, and the war against them is never won, only fought again each day. And it is a hard, kneeling, scrubbing labour that leaves the hands raw, and it is done not for show but because dirt breeds sickness, and a well-kept house is a matter of pride and of health both. A slovenly house was a reproach. A woman felt keenly. A clean one, scrubbed and scoured and sanded and shining what little it had to shine, was a quiet daily achievement wrung from grease and ash, by nothing but water and sand and labour. The afternoon's work, when the heavy tasks allow, is the endless quiet business of the needle. There is always mending, a torn shirt, a worn elbow, a seam gone, a stocking with a hole in the heel that must be darned before it grows. There is always knitting, stockings above all, endless stockings, for a family goes through them, and they must be knitted by hand. And a woman knits in every spare moment, walking, talking, resting, her fingers going of their own accord. There is the making of new clothes when cloth allows, cut carefully to waste nothing, and the cutting down of worn adult clothes into garments for the children, and the letting out and taking in as children grow and bodies change. And there was a whole ladder of skill in the needle, from the plainest mending to real artistry. The plain sewing, the making and mending of shirts and shifts, the hemming and seaming and patching was the daily bread of it, learned young and practiced endlessly. But above that lay the finer work, the marking of linen with the household's initials in neat cross-stitch so it could be told apart, and its washing tract, the making of samplers by the girls as they learned their stitches and their letters both at once, the fine whitework and quilting. In a house with any leisure and any thread to spare, the small, beautiful pieces a woman made to gladden a plain world. Your 8-year-old is at the beginning of this long road, set to her first sampler perhaps, labouring over her letters in thread under your eye, and the making of it is her schooling and her scripture and her needlework all in one, the thing she will keep her whole life and her daughters after her. Even in a life this hard and this plain there was room, here and there, in the winter evenings and the quiet hours, for a little beauty made by hand, a patterned quilt pieced from precious scraps, a bit of fine stitching on a best cap, a sampler framed on the wall, small flowers of skill and care grown in the narrow soil of a working life, and treasured all the more for the labour they cost. A shirt in this house might be worn by the father, then cut down for a son, then cut down again for a smaller child, then finally, when it can be a garment no longer, torn into rags for cleaning and bandaging, and at the very last sold to the ragman. Nothing is thrown away while a single further use remains in it. And all of this cutting and stitching and darning and knitting fills the afternoons and the evenings, the quieter hours, threaded in among everything else, so that a woman's hands are almost never truly still from the time she rises to the time she banks the fire at night. You keep no written accounts most likely, or very few, but you carry in your mind an intricate and constantly shifting ledger of what the household has and what it lacks and what is owed and what is due. You know how much salt pork is left in the barrel and how far into the winter it must stretch. You know how many candles are made and how many more you must dip before the dark months. You know that the eggs are plentiful now and that you can spare a basket of them to trade at the shop for the salt and the needles you need, and that the butter you did not use can go the same way, and that the length of cloth you have woven beyond the family's need is worth a good deal in trade, and that the neighbour's wife owes you a turn of help at your next great wash, because you helped at her soap making, and that you owe the miller for the grinding and will settle it at the harvest. This is the real economy of this world, and women ran a huge share of it, a dense personal web of barter and credit and mutual obligation, coin passing rarely, memory doing the work of money, neighbours bound to one another by 100 small unwritten debts of labour and goods, and you are in your own house its treasurer and its accountant and its manager, and you carry all of it effortlessly the way you carry the water, and think nothing of it. And underneath the accounting runs a quiet arithmetic of survival, especially now, with winter coming on. You are always, in some corner of your mind, measuring the stores against the months. So much salt meat, so many bushels of meal, so much cider and cheese and butter and dried fruit and roots, against so many mouths and so many weeks until the spring brings anything new. A rich year with a full harvest and a full cellar, and the sum comes out comfortable, and you can face the cold with an easy heart. A poor year with a blighted crop or a lost animal or a store spoiled, and the sum comes out thin, and you begin quietly to plan the stretching and the sparing that will see the family through, the smaller portions, the eking out, the careful husbanding of what there is. It is a calculation a woman carries in her head all winter long, watching the stores go down, judging whether they will last. And it is one of the real and constant cares of her life. This sum of food against time, never written down, never spoken of much, always there. And then, in the middle of the afternoon, there is a knock, or more likely no knock at all, but simply a face at the open door and a voice, because a neighbour has come. Company, in this world, is not the interruption it can feel like in ours. It is the chief pleasure and the great news carrier and the binding of a life that is otherwise hard and isolated. The nearest neighbour is a quarter-mile off, or half a mile, or more, across the fields. The nearest town is a journey. A woman can go for days seeing no face but her own family's, and so the arrival of a neighbour come to borrow a little leaven for her bread, or to return a bowl, or to bring a remedy, or simply to sit for a quarter of an hour, is a bright thread in the day. She comes in, and you give her the good chair by the fire, and you make her welcome with whatever you have, a cup of cider, a bit of the day's baking, and you talk. You talk of the children, whose is teething, and whose is walking, and whose is poorly. You talk of a marriage that is being arranged, and a birth that is coming, and a death over in the next parish. You exchange the small, hard-won knowledge of your shared craft, how her cheese came out, what she does for a cough that you might try, whether the walnuts are good this year. There is a whole etiquette to this, unwritten and perfectly understood. You lend and you borrow constantly, a little leaven to start the bread, a few coals if a fire has died, a tool, a cup of some ingredient run short, and every loan is remembered and every kindness returned, not by strict accounting, but by a long, easy sense of mutual obligation that binds the neighbourhood together. You help at one another's great labours, at the wash, at the soap-making, at a birth, at a death, at the quilting and the husking and the harvest, so that the heaviest jobs are lightened by company and paid back in kind. A woman alone could not manage. A woman among neighbours could. And so the visit that looks, from outside, like a pleasant idle quarter of an hour is in truth one of the threads of a strong and necessary web. The web of neighbourliness that turned a scatter of isolated farms into a community that could hold, that could care for its own, that could get its people through the hard times that came to everyone sooner or later. And through this talk, and the visits back and forth, and the meeting on a Sunday, a whole community holds itself together, women knowing the intimate business of every household for miles, minding one another's sick, attending one another's births and deaths, lending and borrowing and helping, so that no family, however isolated its farm, is ever quite alone. There is also the stranger, now and then, and hospitality to the passing traveller was a plain duty of this world, not a favour. The roads are poor and inns are few and far between in the back country, and a traveller benighted on the road, a peddler with his pack, a drover, a man riding to the town on business. Now and then a preacher or an official would come to a farmhouse and ask for a meal and a bed by the fire, and would be given them, and think it no imposition to ask, nor you any imposition to grant, because tomorrow it might be your own husband or son far from home and needing the same. So a stranger might sit at your board of an evening, and share your stew, and sleep on the settle or the floor by the banked fire, and in the morning go on his way, and in exchange he would leave behind the one thing a traveller always carried, and an isolated farm always hungered for: news. News of the town, of the next parish, of the wider colony, of the world. The peddler unpacked his small wares and his large budget of gossip together, and the family gathered to hear both, and this was how word moved through a country with no other easy way to carry it, hand to hand, hearth to hearth, along the roads, in the mouths of travellers given supper and a place by the fire. Your hospitality brought you the world's news, and both were freely given, and it was one of the small pleasures and one of the plain duties of a life lived far from the road. And there is a whole world that runs beneath and between the households, a world almost entirely of women, that the men scarcely see, and the histories almost never mention, and it comes most sharply into view at the two great thresholds of life, birth and death. For at both of these it is the women who gather. When a woman of the neighbourhood comes to her time, it is not a doctor who is sent for, it is the midwife, an older woman of skill and standing, who has delivered half the parish, and with her come the neighbour women and the kin, gathering in the birthing room to help and to wait and to support, sometimes for many hours, sometimes for a day and a night. Childbirth is the gravest danger of a woman's life, more dangerous by far than anything the men face on the farm, and every woman knows it. To go into labour was to go, as they said, into the valley of the shadow, and some did not come out, and the women who gathered round the bed had all faced it themselves, and would face it again. So the birthing room was a place of fear, but also of a fierce and practical female solidarity, women doing for one another the thing no one else could do, and the midwife who was good at her work was one of the most respected figures in the whole community, trusted with the very edge of life and death. You yourself have borne your children in that room, with those women about you, and you have gone to sit with others in theirs, and you will again, and it binds you to the women around you with a bond deeper than almost any other, and at the other threshold the same. When someone dies, it is again the women who come, who wash and dress the body, and lay it out in the cold parlour, who sit with the family, who bring food, who do the quiet necessary work around a death. Birth and death, the entrances and the exits, were women's ground, tended by women's hands, and this gave to the women of a district a knowledge of one another's deepest moments, and a network of mutual obligation and care that ran quite invisibly beneath the ordered visible world the men governed. It has its own kind of power, unwritten and unofficial and real, but there is one day that gathers everyone, and it stands over the whole week like a steeple over the fields, and that is Sunday, the Sabbath, and it is worth telling you what it meant, because it shaped the very rhythm of your days. On the Sabbath, all this labour stops. It is required to stop. In the New England colonies, the Sabbath is kept strictly, and the law itself frowns on unnecessary work on the Lord's day, and so the endless round of spinning and washing and heavy cooking is set aside, and the family makes its way, on foot or in the cart, to the meeting house, the plain unadorned church that is the very centre of the town's life, its spiritual centre and its social centre and its governing centre all at once. And there you sit, often for hours, through long sermons in an unheated building, in winter with a little footstove of coals to keep the worst of the cold from your feet, and you worship, and you also, let us be honest, you see everyone. You see who is there, and who is missing, who is newly wed, and who is newly widowed, who is expecting, who has come down in the world, and who has risen. The whole community is assembled and legible in those pews, ranked and seated by their standing, and the meeting house is where marriages are published and news is spread, and the business of the town is settled. And beyond the weekly Sabbath, there are the greater gatherings that punctuate the year, and that a hard-working woman looked forward to as bright, fixed points in the round of labour. There are the fairs and the market days in the town, when the district comes together to trade and to see and be seen, and you go with your eggs and your butter and your cheese and your cloth to sell or barter, and come back with the few things you cannot make, and the news of the wider world. There are weddings, celebrated with what feasting a family could manage. There are the shared work frolics that turned necessary labour into festivity, the husking bees where the corn was stripped of an evening with singing and cider and courting among the young folk, the quilting bees where the women gathered to finish a quilt on its frame and gossip the day away, the raising of a new barn where the whole neighbourhood came to lift the heavy frame together and were fed for their trouble. Work and pleasure were not so divided then as now. The labour that had to be done was made, wherever it could be, into an occasion, a coming together, so that the very tasks that filled the year also wove the community tight. These were the festivals of a working world, and a woman kept them in her heart through the long solitary weeks between, and did her share to make them, and was gladdened by them. It is your one true gathering, your one release from the farm, and though it is solemn, it is also, in its way, your society, your theatre, your newspaper, your week's one certain human throng. The Sabbath itself begins the evening before, in the strict old reckoning, and it shapes the whole end of the working week. On the Saturday there is a great push to get everything done and ready, the extra cooking, so that little need be done on the Lord's day, the clothes brushed and readied, the one good outfit each person owns, the best cap, the clean linen, the household set in order. For on the Sabbath the wheel stands still, and the pot is only warmed, and the heavy work is set aside, and a family caught doing needless labor on the Lord's Day would be marked and spoken of. So the Saturday evening has a particular feel, a drawing down, a readying, the work of the week finished, and the day of rest and worship coming on. The getting there is itself a labor. In a world with no easy travel, you go on foot if the meeting house is near, or in the cart behind the ox or the horse if it is far, the whole family bundled against the cold, the roads rutted mud or frozen ruts or dust by the season. And you stay the whole day, for the New England Sabbath is no brief hour. There is a lengthy morning service and an afternoon one to match, with a short bleak break between, in which families eat the cold food they have brought, and gather at the noon house to warm themselves before going back in. The meeting house itself is unheated, on principle and by long habit, and in the depth of winter it is bitterly, achingly cold, the breath of the minister and the congregation showing in the air the only warmth the little footstoves of coals the women carry in, and the dog lying across the feet. You sit through it, and you are watched, for there is a tithing man whose task is to keep good order, to wake the sleepers with a long rod, to still the fidgeting children, to see that the Sabbath is kept as it should be, and where you sit tells the whole town your place in it, for the pews are assigned by standing by wealth, by office, by age, by family, the most honoured nearest the front, and to be seated is to be publicly ranked, so that the seating of the meeting house was a matter of real and sometimes bitter importance, a map of the community's order laid out in oak. The men sit on one side, the women on the other, in the old way, and through the long hours you worship truly, for the faith is real and deep, and the fear of God is the frame of the whole moral world. But you also take the measure of your neighbours, and are measured, and the week's news and standing and change are all quietly legible in that room. It is your church, and your town hall, and your gazette, and your assembly all at once, the one fixed point of the week, and you would no more miss it than miss the sunrise. And it is worth saying plainly, here in the quiet, what your place is in that ordered world, because the law of it would seem very strange and very hard to us. As a married woman, you have, in the eyes of that law, almost no separate existence at all. What was yours before your marriage became your husband's the day you wed. You cannot own property in your own name. What money you earn by your butter and your cloth is, in law, your husband's. You cannot make a contract that binds. If your husband dies, you do not simply inherit all he had. The law gives you your portion, your dower, the use of a third, and the rest goes to the children. And if you have young children, you may find yourself dependent on your own sons as they come of age. A widow had more freedom than a wife, in the cold letter of it. She could hold property and make contracts and run a farm in her own right, and many did, and ran them well. But she had also lost the working partner without whom the farm was a crushing burden for one pair of hands. There was no easy place in that legal world for a woman standing on her own. The whole structure assumed her folded into a household under a man, and a woman alone, wife or widow or spinster, made her way through the gaps in it as best she could, by law, where the law allowed, and by sheer competence and the goodwill of neighbours where it did not. You cannot make a will freely, or sign a binding contract, or sue in a court, or sit on a jury, or vote in any election, for there is no election in which any woman may vote. In the cold language of the law, you are very nearly your husband's dependent in all things. And yet, and this is the thing I want you to hold, because it is the truth that the law leaves out within the walls of this house, you are not powerless at all. You are the mistress of a complex and essential enterprise. Your knowledge keeps this family alive. Your labor clothes and feeds and warms and doctors them. Your judgment runs the household economy. Your husband, whatever the law may say about who owns what, knows perfectly well that without you the whole thing collapses within a week, and treats you, in the ordinary run of a decent marriage, as the partner you in fact are. The law wrote one story, the kitchen told another. Both were true at once, and women lived, as women so often have, in the wide gap between them. Think of the marriage itself, at the heart of it. You did not marry most likely for the reasons we marry now, or not only for them. You married young, in your late teens or early 20s, and you married a man of about your own station whom you knew or came to, and the match was as much a practical joining of two working lives as it was anything else. For a farm cannot be run by a man alone or a woman alone. It needs both, each doing the half of the work the other cannot. And a widow or a widower on a farm remarried quickly from sheer necessity, because half a partnership cannot keep a household alive. So your marriage is a working partnership as much as a romance, and there is no shame in that, and no coldness in it either. The affection grew in the doing, in the years of shared labour, and shared children, and shared hardship, into something that the plain word love does not quite cover, but does not miss by much. You know this man as you know few things, his moods, his silences, the sound of his step, the way he is at the end of a hard day, and he knows you, and between you over the years, in the running of this place, and the raising of these children and the burying of that one on the hill, has grown the deep, unspoken partnership that is the true centre of the household, whatever the law of property may say about who owns the cow. And it is at the meeting house, or brought home from the town by your husband, or carried up the lane by that visiting neighbour, that the other matter reaches you, the thing happening far away in the great cities on the coast, that will one day change everything, and that on this ordinary afternoon in 1770 is still only a distant murmur at the edge of your world. There is a newspaper, perhaps, that has found its way to the house, a single folded sheet, already 3 weeks old by the time it reaches this far-up country, pass from hand to hand until it is soft and worn. Or there is talk after the sermon, the men gathered in a knot outside the meeting house, their voices low and serious. Something is stirring down in Boston and in the ports. There has been trouble over taxes, over stamps and duties laid on by a parliament across the ocean in which no one here has any voice. There has been trouble over tea, and over soldiers quartered in the town, and only this year there was blood on the snow in Boston, a handful of townsmen shot dead by the king's soldiers in the street, and the word of it has rippled outward through every parish in the colonies, carried on those worn sheets of newsprint, and by word of mouth, and men are using a word they did not use to use, the word liberty, and saying it in a new way, a hard way, a way that has the beginning of something in it. And here is the strange thing, the thing you cannot yet see. This quarrel of the distant cities is already, quietly, reaching into your own kitchen, though you would not name it so. There is an agreement abroad in the colonies, spreading from the ports outward, that the people will stop buying the goods that England taxes, will not buy the tea, will not buy the fine imported cloth, will make do instead with what they can produce themselves. And that agreement lands, when it lands, squarely on the woman of the house, because it is she who decides what is bought and what is made, she who keeps or breaks the boycott at the shop counter and the tea table, to drink your tea or to pour it away, to buy the smooth English cloth, or to wear your own rough homespun with your chin up. These become, in these years, small daily acts with a great meaning folded inside them, and they are women's acts made in kitchens and at market stalls by the 100,000, and they will matter more than anyone yet knows. The men will make the speeches and before long march away to the fighting. But the long, slow squeeze of the boycott, the refusal that starves the quarrel of its profits, that is being carried on in rooms like this one, by women like you, deciding what to buy and what to do without. You catch the edges of this. You are not a fool, and you are not indifferent. Your husband speaks of it, and you listen, and you have your own thoughts, though you are not asked for them, and you do not offer them at the meeting house where such things are men's talk. But it is far away. It is a thing of the cities and the ports and the printed page, and your world is the fire and the well and the wheel and the sick child and the barrel of salt pork that must last the winter. If someone were to lean into your kitchen on this October afternoon and tell you that within 5 years there would be war in these colonies, real war, and that your husband and your 11-year-old son might march away to it, and that the very cloth you are spinning at this wheel would become, in a few years' time, a quiet act of defiance, homespun worn on purpose, in place of the fine English goods, a patriot would no longer buy. You would very likely not believe them, and you would certainly not stop your work to discuss it, because the light is beginning to go and there is supper to get and the animals to see to, and the whole long closing of the day still ahead of you. It is worth sitting for a moment with how the vast events of an age actually reach an ordinary life, because it is not the way the histories make it seem. There is no sudden thunderclap. There is only this. A worn newspaper 3 weeks old, passed hand to hand up the country until the ink is soft. A knot of men talking low and serious after the Sunday meeting, their faces grave. A traveller at the fire of an evening with fresh word from the coast. A price gone up at the shop, a good grown scarce, a thing everyone used to buy that a decent person now goes without. The great matters arrive as rumour and small inconvenience and grave talk, drop by drop, into a life whose real business is the fire and the water and the bread, and are half heard, turned over, folded into the day's endless work, and only slowly, over years, do the drops become a flood. You are living on this ordinary October day in the last few years of the old settled world, and you cannot see it because no one ever can. The change comes disguised as ordinary days, one after another, each with its water to carry and its bread to bake, until one day it is here. History is coming up the lane toward this house, but it is not here yet. Tonight there is only the work, and the fading light, and the family, and the fire. For the light is going now, the early dark of an October evening drawing in, and the day begins its long, gentle folding toward night. Supper is a small meal, an easy one, and a relief after the labour of the day. It is not the full-cooked dinner of the afternoon. It is the leftovers of that dinner, warmed through, the cold remains of the stew, bread and butter and cheese, perhaps some of the mush from the morning fried up, milk for the children, cider for the grown. In some houses supper was little more than a bowl of bread and milk, or of the morning's mush warmed again, eaten by the failing dusk, with hardly a pause in the day's other tasks. In others it was the best remains of the midday dinner, the stew warmed through, bread and butter and cheese, a bit of pie, cold meat, whatever the day had left. It is a plain and easy meal by design, because the cook is tired and the light is going, and the main effort of the day's cooking was made at noon. The evening asks only to be got through gently, fed simply, wound down toward rest. And there is a mercy in that, at the end of a day like this, that the last meal is the easy one, that the household can eat its bread and milk in the dusk without ceremony and drift toward the fire and the night, the great labour behind them, the small quiet close of the day ahead. Nobody makes much of supper. It is eaten as the light dies. In the last of the day, if you can manage it, to save the candles, the family drifting to the board tired and quieter now, the great push of the day behind them. The animals have been seen to, the cows milked a second time, the poultry shut up against the fox, the wood brought in for the morning and stacked by the hearth to dry and to be ready. The children are heavy-eyed, and the house, warmed all day by that faithful fire, is at its most comfortable now, in the evening, with the dark pressing at the windows, and the family gathered in the one bright room. Before the family settles, though, the day's last outdoor rounds must be made, and they belong partly to you and partly to the men. The cows are milked a second time, and the evening milk dealt with. The poultry are counted in and shut up tight against the fox and the raccoon that hunt the dark. The pigs and the beasts are fed and watered and secured. The wood for the morning is carried in and stacked by the hearth, where it will dry and be ready to hand before dawn, so that the first thing of the new day is not a cold trip to the woodpile. The doors are barred. The house is drawn in on itself against the night, made snug and safe and whole, everything living gathered inside or shut secure, and only then does the family truly settle to its rest. And then, at last, comes the sweetest part of the day, the small still evening hour before sleep, and I want to give it to you slowly, because it is the reward for all the rest. The very last of the outdoor work is done. The one candle is lit, or the two, set on the table, and the family draws in close around that little pool of gold and the glow of the fire, and the dark room closes softly around the edges. And still, even now, the hands are not quite idle, because idle hands are a state this world does not really know. But the evening work is the gentle work, the sitting work. You take up your mending, or a stocking to knit, or you go back to the wheel a while. It's hum low now in the quiet. There is a companionable ease in it. The two of you and the children by the fire, each at some small quiet task, or none, the day's driving urgency finally spent. Your husband mends a harness or whittles a new handle for a tool, or simply sits, easing his back. The older girl knits beside you. A word passes now and then, of tomorrow's plan, of a beast, of a child, of the price of something at the shop, and then the silence comes back, easy and unforced. The silence of two people who have worked side by side for years and need no filling of the quiet. This is the marriage, in the end, as much as anything grander. These hours by the fire, the day's work done, the low talk and the easy silence, the partnership resting a moment from its labor. There is not much romance in it, as the songs would have romance, but there is something better and deeper, a worn and unbreakable belonging, and you would not trade it, tired as you are, for anything the earth could offer. Perhaps a psalm is sung, the family's voices rising plain and unaccompanied, or a chapter of the Bible spoken aloud by the light of that single flame, the one book that is very often the only book in the house. Its familiar words, the frame around the end of every day. And there is a quality to this fire-lit hush that we, with all our brightness and noise, have almost entirely lost. No task is coming for you now. The engine of the day has at last been allowed to stop, and there is no world beyond these warm walls that can reach you. The children are safe under the roof. The animals are safe in the dark. The fire is warm, and there is nothing to do, nothing at all, but sit, and mend a little, and talk a little, and be together in the low gold light, while the night stands enormous outside. It is a completeness that a life of constant labor earns, and a life of constant distraction can never quite find. The hands rest. The day is done. And into that quiet the old stories come, and the old songs told and sung 100 times, worn smooth as river stones, asking nothing, comforting simply by being familiar. The same words in the same firelight that the grandmothers spoke, and the grandchildren will speak. For this is an oral culture, a world that lives by the spoken and the remembered far more than by the written. And the firelit evening is where it is passed on. The old tales are told, the ghost stories that made the children shiver and glance at the dark corners, the tales of witches and haunts and signs and wonders that everyone half believed, the family stories of grandfathers and old times and the crossing of the sea, the folk wisdom and the weather lore and the sayings, all handed down by the voice in the firelight from the old to the young. The songs are sung, the ballads and the hymns and the psalms, the same tunes carried down the generations unwritten. It is how a child learns who its people are, and where they came from, and how the world works, and what to fear, and what to hope. It is history and religion and entertainment and instruction all braided into the one evening voice by the one small light. We have lost this almost entirely. We who have every story in the world at fingertip and need no one to tell us any of them. But there by the fire, in the dark, the told tale and the sung song were precious things, worn smooth with retelling, binding the family to its own past and to one another, and the children fell asleep to them, up in the cold loft, with the murmur of the grown voices and the crackle of the fire coming up faint through the boards. This is the peace at the bottom of the hard day. This is what it was all for. And then the fire, one last time, because the day that began with the fire must end with it too. The children go up the ladder to the cold loft, carried if they are small, climbing sleepily if they are bigger, and they burrow under the coverlets into the warmth of one another, and the house falls quiet above you. The candle is pinched out, its precious tallow saved. You do not let a candle burn for nothing, and you go, last of all, to the hearth, to do the thing that closes every single day of your life, and makes the next one possible, the thing this whole evening has been circling back toward from the very first minute. There is a right way to do it, learned long ago, and you do it without thinking. You draw the last of the day's burning coals together into a compact glowing heap, close packed, for a heap holds its heat far better than scattered embers. And then you cover it, drawing a blanket of the fine ashes over the top and sides with the little shovel, sealing the coals under their grey coverlet, or setting the iron curfew down over them and pushing it snug to the warm back wall of the chimney. Covered so, starved of air, the coals cannot flame up and cannot spread, but neither can they quite die. They will smoulder low and slow through the whole long night, a banked red heart under the grey, holding just enough life to be woken in the morning. It is the same fire, kept alive from day to day and week to week. A careful housewife might keep one fire going for a whole winter and longer, never once letting it out, banked each night and woken each dawn, the continuous thread of warmth around which the life of the house is wound. You rake the glowing coals together into a heap at the center of the hearth. You draw the ashes over them, banking them, or you set the curfew, that curved iron cover, down over the embers and push it back against the warm bricks of the chimney's back wall. You are burying the fire gently, the way you would tuck in a child, so that it will sleep through the night, without dying, without escaping, so that its red heart will still be beating faintly under the grey in the black cold hour. Before tomorrow's dawn, when you will kneel here again and wake it again and begin the long round again, you do it by feel, in the near dark, the only glow in the room, the dull red of the coals themselves. And there is something almost tender in this final act, this covering of the fire, that I want you to feel as the very last act before the day ends. All day the fire has served you, has cooked and warmed and worked without rest, as you have. Now you put it to bed, as you have put the children to bed, gathering it in, covering it over, keeping it safe and warm through the dark, so that it will be there in the morning to begin again. The whole day has been a circle, from the waking of the fire before dawn to the banking of it after dark. And every day of your existence is such a circle, and the circles make the seasons, and the seasons make the years, and the years make a whole life live close to the hearth, the earth, and the turning light. It is a life without much that we would call event, but it is not, for all that, a small one. It is full of deep use and deep skill and deep love, lived entire, and sealed each night with this quiet, careful act, the covering of the fire. And that is the day. That is one single ordinary day in the life of a woman whose name is in no history book, who commanded no armies and signed no declarations, and will be remembered by no one beyond a stone on a hill, and whose labor, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of women exactly like her across a young country, was the foundation on which every one of those famous men stood. She kept the fire, she carried the water, she made the food and the soap and the candles and the cloth, she grew the herbs and doctored the sick and buried the child and got up the next morning and did it all again. And she did it, most days, not in misery, but in a kind of steady, unglamorous, deeply rooted contentment, in a world that moved at the speed of the seasons and the light, close to her family, her animals, and the earth, her days full of hard work and small pleasures and long silences, lit at the end by one candle and warmed by one faithful fire. And think, as you drift, of where she stands in the great story we usually tell. When we speak of this time and this country, we speak of the men in the meeting houses and the congresses, the pamphlets and the speeches, the shot on the green and the crossing of the river, the founding of a nation, and all of that is true, and all of it matters. But under every one of those men stood a household, and every one of those households stood on the ceaseless labor of a woman, exactly like the one whose day you have shared tonight. A woman who fed the men who marched, who spun the cloth that clothed them, who kept the farm alive through the years they were gone to the fighting, who bore and raised the next generation of the Republic, who did all of it without a vote or a voice or a line in the histories, and thought nothing of it, and asked for nothing. The revolution that was coming would be won not only in the field but in 10,000 kitchens like this one, by the quiet refusals and the endless labor and the sheer unbreakable endurance of women whose names are gone. She did not know she was the foundation of anything. She only knew there was water to carry and bread to bake and a fire to keep. But she was the foundation, all the same, and it seems only right, lying here in the warm dark 2.5 centuries on, to know her day and to honor it. I do not tell you this to make you wish you lived then. The labor was real, and the losses were real, and the ease we have would have seemed to her like a dream of heaven. Consider, above all, the pace of it. Her day was long and hard, but it moved at the speed of the body and the fire and the daylight, not at the speed of the machine. When she carried water, she walked. When she spun, the wheel turned only as fast as her hand. When she baked, she waited on the slow heat of the bricks. When the light failed, the day was over, and there was nothing to be done but rest. She could not hurry the butter or the bread or the dawn. She lived inside the natural rhythms of the living earth, the turning of the light and the seasons, the slow, patient processes of growing and making and mending. And though the work was ceaseless, it was never frantic in the way our own days can be, never fragmented into 100 pulling directions at once, never lived at the mercy of a device that could reach her anywhere. Her attention was whole. When she did a thing, she did that thing with her hands, from beginning to end, and saw the result of it, the risen loaf, the finished cloth, the filled cellar, the fed child. There is a wholeness in that, a completeness, a rootedness in the physical present, that our own scattered and accelerated lives have largely lost, and that some part of us aches for without quite knowing its name. But there is something in the shape of her day, I think, that is worth carrying with you into sleep. The sense of every action mattering, of hands that always knew what to do, of a life lived wholly inside its own small warm circle of firelight, and family, unhurried, unwatched, complete. The world she could not yet imagine was coming for her up the lane, with its revolutions and its machines and its speed. But on this one October night in 1770, none of that has arrived, and the great world she cannot yet see is coming for her, all the same. In 5 years or so, if this is the household I think it is, the drums will reach even this quiet lane. Her husband may take down the musket from over the door and march away toward Boston with the other men of the town, and her son not long after him, and she will be left, as so many thousands of women were left, to run the whole farm alone through the years of the war, to plough and reap and manage and provide, to do the men's work and her own both, to hold the place and the family together while the fighting drags on somewhere over the horizon, and to spin at her wheel the very homespun that had become a banner of the cause. She does not know this yet. Tonight she knows only the fire and the water and the bread and the sleeping children. But when the time comes, she will meet it the way she meets everything, without fuss and without complaint, and she will endure. Because enduring is the deepest thing she knows how to do, and the young country will stand, in no small part, on women exactly like her, holding the home ground while history was made elsewhere. But all of that is years away. On this one October night in 1770, there is only the banked fire, and the sleeping children, and the dark and the good tiredness of a day of honest work, and the certainty that tomorrow the sun will come up behind the eastern hills, and it will all begin again. If these quiet evenings are something you would like to find again, you are always welcome to subscribe. And if you have enjoyed this evening together, this walk through one long day in another time, I would love a comment telling me where in the world you were listening from. I look through all of them, and they are one of the real pleasures of doing this. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.